seconds kind of thing. Yeah.
Right. Or if they're on the phone and not on the computer, that makes sense. But just making sure. All right. Sorry, it's already time. Good evening. Today is, oh gosh, I don't even know what day it is.
Monday.
18th?
Monday,
19th.
April 19th.
19th.
Yeah, 19th. I'm glad I'm not the only one. This is the Historic Preservation Commission, and I'm going to read our procedures. All commissioners will be on video. Commissioners and staff will be asked to click raise hand when they wish to speak. The chair will call on individuals to speak. Commissioners and staff are asked to keep their microphones muted until called upon. Members of the public will be muted during presentations and commissioner discussion. For public participation, the public may join the meeting from the computer or dial in by phone. All public members are muted upon entry. To make a comment during public comment segments, if you're on a computer, click the raise hand icon. It is either in the participants panel on the right of your screen or in the control panel at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And you may have to hover over that area to see it. If you're on the phone, hit *9 to raise your hand. The chair will call upon those with raised hands, and you'll be unmuted when called upon. Speakers are limited to 3 minutes. So those are our procedures. And can we do a roll call, please?
Commissioner Dunlap.
Yes, here.
Commissioner Keller.
Yes, I'm here.
Commissioner Berg.
Here.
Commissioner Clemmy. I think you're muted, Andrea, but you're here.
Here.
Chair Haley.
Here. All right, and looking at our agenda for this evening, you don't have any changes or additions. Otherwise, we can move to approve.
I moved that the agenda be approved.
Do you have a second?
I'll second.
Second.
All right, all those in favor?
Aye.
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 All right, and then looking at our minutes from our last meeting, March 15th. Do you have any changes to those minutes, or do we make a motion to approve?
I'll move to approve the minutes from last month's meeting. Second that.
All those in favor? Aye.
Aye.
All those in favor? Aye. All those opposed? All right, and then any public comments on items that are not on our agenda for this evening? And Leah is here. Hi, Leah. You can speak.
Just wanted to say that I'm here. I'm the Historical Commission liaison for you. So if you have any thing you want me to bring back to the Historical Commission, just let me know. At any time, I'm taking notes for the whole thing. So
Okay. Great. Thank you. Appreciate you being here. I don't see other public comments. So our first item is a referral for 950 Spruce Street. We'll have a staff presentation.
All right, good evening, everyone. I'm Rob Zuccaro, Planning and Building Safety Director. I'm going to be doing the staff presentation this evening. So let me share my screen. Okay, so hopefully you can all see the slide presentation now. So this is a development proposal. It's not a historic preservation application, as you know. It's not eligible for landmarking. The property, the building on the property is too new. But as you know, every time we have a development in downtown, the downtown commercial area, we do take it to the Historic Preservation Commission for review as a referral and to get a recommendation for the Planning Commission and City Council. So this proposal is for a mixed-use residential and commercial development at 950 Spruce Street with a proposal for a row of 3 homes fronting 725 Front Street. So it's a planned unit development, which is the site development plan approval, and then a special review use or an SRU for the residential uses. So if you aren't familiar, we have uses by right, and then we have conditional uses or special review uses in our code, which means that they may be appropriate, but it's specific to the context of where they're being proposed. There's a whole different set of review criteria. You can have conditions and so forth. So within the core area of downtown, that's how residential is treated, and then a plat to consolidate the properties. So again, you're asked to make a recommendation to Planning Commission and City Council on each of these application types. And here's the property, just to get you oriented. Here's Main and Spruce. Here's the Louisville Public Library across the street. 740 Front, which is one of our landmark properties. The restaurant is located across the street, and then there's an office building here. There's some smaller buildings to the south, and then the gas station to the south of that on Front Street. Okay, so again, the proposal is to take the existing building and take the second floor commercial space, and through that special review use, allow anywhere from 3 to 5 residential units. So 5 residential units would take up the whole floor, but they're contemplating having some residential units and then retaining some office space on that second floor as well. So that's why it's 3 to 5. And then they'd be changing out some of the windows, and then on the rear of the property here, hopefully you can see my cursor, they would have some storage areas and decks, some staircases for those residential property. And then in this location down here is where the row homes are, the 3 row homes are facing Front Street. They'd be reconfiguring the parking lot as well. They'd be closing the existing curb cut that goes into the parking lot. So all of the traffic would come, all of the cars for this parking lot and the homes would come in off of the alley, rather than through a curb cut off of Front Street. So they'd be filling in that gap with some street trees and continuing that brick banding of the streetscape. Okay, so here are the elevations from the architect, and I'll let the architect go into this in more detail. But here's the existing office building. It is at 30 feet. The proposal is a 36-foot tall, 3-story residential building. Here's a perspective view. So a little bit of background on the property before I get into the staff analysis. So again, this isn't eligible for landmarking. The original building was built in 1984. It was known as the Fisher Building. Not long after that, it was converted to the city's library in 1989. It actually started out as a mix of the library, and they retained some commercial uses, but as the library grew over time, it eventually became the entire library before the new library was built across the street. And that was, I think, 2006. And then this building was converted back to a commercial use, office, retail, had an expansion approved in 2006, and it was remodeled. So what you're looking at tonight, what we really try to focus on again are the downtown design handbook and the framework plan. That's kind of the comprehensive plan, but really it's been translated into the design handbook. So there's a whole series of policies in there that are intended to kind of preserve the traditional and historic character of downtown. And that's why I think it's important for HPC especially to be a referral on these projects. So this property is within the commercial core. So you can see this large dotted line that's outlining all of downtown. You can see this crosshatch. This is what's called the transition area. And so that's transitioning between the residential and the core commercial area. And it actually has policies for lower height, lower densities, where the core area typically allows more height, more density within the core area. So in your staff memo, page 6 through 14, we really went into a lot of detail on both the core area policies and the general policies that we thought were applicable to this project. So I'm not going to go into all of them, but I just want to point out a few. First, there are a lot of policies about the pedestrian realm, the streetscape, improving that area with both your building design and site design. So filling in that gap and screening the parking lot, I think very much meet those policies. It's an improvement for the streetscape. It's an improvement for the desired character of downtown per the policies. Residential mixed-use development was contemplated in the framework plan. I don't think I specifically noted that in the staff report, but in the framework plan, if you did actually spend any time looking through it, there, the very last section actually talks about this mixed-use concept and does say that it can be supported through an SRU process. There are a couple things that we did point out that we did want to get probably more in-depth discussion with the commission on. And one of that is the building materials on the primary facade. And I'll pull up a few of those policies. And then that third story element. So we have this issue of height and third stories. And there's a lot of policies and one probably applicable code provision to be aware of as it relates to that we want to get your input on. So the first thing is, so here's two policies. These are G, so they're general. So it talks about traditional materials. And of course, you don't want to, you don't want a fake traditional building, but there are a lot of policies about trying to kind of honor the tradition with having different types of materials. And these are those policies there. It talks about having heavier, coarser materials at the foundation. So I think this is and again, I think this is most important at the lower stories in order to kind of create that pedestrian character that we want to preserve downtown. So here's the building, and you can see the first two stories has, at the primary part of the structure does have a brick facade, which I think does meet this standard. But the one thing we pointed to in the staff memo was that there's this composite material that is a large part of the primary facade as well. So we wanted the commission's input on that. It's much more modern. There might be other ways to treat that. Staff even suggested potentially treating that differently with a more traditional design in order to kind of create that streetscape that reinforced the traditional aspects of downtown. So we put together a really quick graphic, just maybe showing where you could do some different treatments to bring, whether it was brick or something else, out to the street front there. And I don't want to focus, I think most of the focus certainly is on the new homes, but there is this kind of bump out for one of the patios for the residential areas. So that might need some treatment as well. So the other big thing to talk about is the policies related to building height. So it's very important to note that, we have different height and density policies. Core area does allow up to 45 feet, but it's not guaranteed up to 45 feet. You still have to try to meet these policies, and there's some design, you need to be, the design needs to respect the traditional context still. And there's a lot of language about trying to achieve kind of less bulk, like 1 and 2 story type bulk and facades. Even if you're in the core area and then transitioning back to those taller buildings. So we have stories and we have height. And here we have a 3-story building, but it's really the height of a tall 2-story building. So I think there's, I think you can have, it would be good to get your thoughts on that. Here's the existing building, the office building. It's 30 feet in height. So that's actually a little lower than what would, be allowed even in the transition area. They're proposing 36 feet, so it is about 6 feet taller than that building there. But here's the policy C3. It says maintain an average scale of 1-story buildings at the sidewalk. Traditionally, most commercial storefronts in this area are 1 to 2 stories. In larger projects, a mix of 1 2-story modules should be maintained and so forth. New construction should present a tall 1-story or 2-story facade at the property line. This facade height should not exceed 30 feet. So I think that, you know, there's things to look at, like the, you know, the decks. So you've got the 2nd and 3rd story decks, which bring some facade elements that are certainly within that 30 feet. So it just depends on what view angle you're looking at it from it as well. Because, you know, some parts of the facade go straight up to 36 feet. I do want to mention that the design guidelines, these are guidelines too. Some of them are mandatory, but a lot of them, they're not mandatory, but you should be trying to meet the intent of them with these designs. So here's another policy. If the 3rd story is to be used, it should appear a subordinate addition. So again, this doesn't talk about height. It's all about stories. So I think in this case, so this is an image directly from the design guidelines. It's a very tall building, but it does show how the 3rd story is being set back. Probably not very visible from a lot of angles from the street. So here's a municipal code section. So again, in the municipal code, it talks about buildings may be up to 45 feet in this core area compared to 35 feet in the transition area. And this is 36. So it's a lower building when you look at that overall allowed height. But then the code goes on to say, in order to ensure varied building heights and the appearance of 2-story building the city council may require a lower building height in order to ensure varied building heights and the appearance of a 2-story building mass from the street and pedestrian scale. So some of the things that staff found really interesting is that you have this brick facade, which is about, I think, 18 or 19 feet tall to this cornice piece here. And so that actually provides some visual element that, you know, it's kind of broken into 2 pieces here. So we thought that that could be one element that mimics having this 2-story massing. You know, it's a modern design. So again, we're really looking forward to your input on these issues. Here's an image from the staff report that shows, again, you couldn't easily do this image, and staff wants to acknowledge that. We're not suggesting you can just slide building pieces around based on all of their site planning. But this is if you took kind of what's in the design guidelines, you'd have something more like this, where you'd have the 2-story massing. You'd really push that 3rd story back. They'd probably have to really redo their site planning and redesign to accomplish this. But again, I think there's these competing ideas of height versus stories that we want to talk about. So those were the things that staff wanted to point out and try to seed some discussion items. I know the applicant has a presentation that they want to make as well. But again, after this, in the next few months, this will go to Planning Commission, City Council. There'll be a formal public hearing on all of these items. And then your recommendation will be put into the record for those public hearings. So I'd be happy to answer any questions from staff's standpoint before Mr. Hartroff makes his presentation.
All right, thank you. Does anyone have any questions for staff? Go ahead.
I might ask for clarification. That C33 said that it sort of says that you're supposed to do a 2-story in that area, right? But this is actually 3-story. So I guess that's the gist of the discussion, that it's not really 2-story. So it's asking for a change from that. Is that right?
Yes. So I think, yeah, it's a little bit nuanced, but I think as staff would look at it is that the question is does this proposal present a 1 or 2 story facade. So you've got an overall building height that there's some things that could point to an overall facade that could be consistent with this. One is that the overall building height is 36 feet. You've got these composite panel elements that kind of mimic a lower slung building height. But, you know, overall, especially if you're looking from, you know, the northeast, you've basically got a 36-foot straight up building, and you do see 3 stories. So there's elements that I think are trying to meet the intent. There are some elements where, you know, if you're interpreting this very closely, you know, you're going to be more like any 2-story needs to be set back, kind of like this image here. And so it's hard to say within this context of downtown. But I also wanted to mention, if I could, not related to your question, a correction from the staff report that I forgot to mention. There is a comparison of building heights in the staff report, and staff did estimate the library to be 32 feet in height, where we actually believe it's probably more between 34 and 36 feet in height, depending on what angle you're viewing the library from.
Okay. All right. Now, the building that was proposed, and I guess it wasn't built, in back of the Huckleberry, but on Main Street, that had a 3rd story that was set back, right? So for that discussion, has it?
Well, we have the
already
same
been a
architect.
precedent?
Yeah, so we have the same architect here this evening, so he can talk about it. But so the original plans that went to City Council did have a 3rd story. It was significantly set back, much more like you would see. And again, this was a commercial building, so it's a little different. This is residential. And it was much taller than 36 feet for those 3 stories. I mean, they were really going up, you know, taking advantage of all the height. So it was taller. But the revised plans got rid of the 3rd story effectively.
Oh, okay.
They did have, I think, like a little kitchenette at the 3rd story for a rooftop deck. But other than that, the majority of the 3rd story was removed.
Okay, thanks.
And the office building across the street, I can't remember if the staff report gave the height of that. The one next to the landmarked facility, but that right across the street, how tall is that?
Yeah, let me pull that up in the staff report. We did estimate that. Okay, so that's 726 front, and we estimated that at about 34 feet in height. So sometimes what we were going off of were the PUDs, if we had a PUD that had a height to scale. And I think we took that from the PUD. Again, we didn't verify, you know, as built. Sometimes it differs a little bit as it gets built, but the PUD plan, I think, had 34 feet.
Thank you.
Any other questions for staff? The comparison heights are helpful for the surrounding buildings, so that was really good. All right, so we will hear from the applicant. We'll give him permission to share screen.
He should be coming on as a panelist right now.
Oh, okay.
And Eric, as a panelist, you
need-
should have ability to share your screen, so feel free to do so.
Okay, great. Good evening, everybody. Thanks for having us tonight. So I think that this is a pretty interesting project from a lot of reasons. Trying to do a mixed-use project downtown. The only one we really have is over at just south of Moxie, the Moffett Lofts. was done quite a few years ago, but nobody's attempted to put residential downtown since then. And so, or there has been one attempt that got shot down actually, but this I think will be a good use. I'm actually in the office building at 950 Spruce right now, and we don't need as much space as we used to. And the other office tenants here don't need as much space as they used to. So if you look around, there's a lot of empty office building, not just in Louisville, but all over. And so trying to repurpose some of these spaces. And I think it's important for downtown to think about the uses as well, because without the office users, a lot of our restaurants and even retail that we have depend on our population downtown. And without a population, then they're going to suffer. And so bringing some residential use, I think, is an important thing to do. If you do go back and read the framework plan, we did that back in the 90s. I was on all these steering committees back when we were looking at parking and historic preservation and all the things that we have now. It came up that a lot of the buildings downtown were residential. There were little houses intermixed with the businesses. You had mom and pop live work units downtown, and our zoning code doesn't allow residential downtown. It prohibits it unless you get a special review use. And in fact, if you have a residential use and then you stop using it and you use it for commercial, then you don't get the residential use back without having to go through a special use review. So we thought in the framework plan it was important to say that residential is a historic use downtown, actually, and that it would be a good thing to keep it for a lot of reasons. Sustainability and walkability and eyes on the street and nightlife. There's a lot of good reasons to have residential downtown. So I'm hopeful that this will actually spur some additional projects to bring residential back to downtown. And maybe even a zoning change, I think, would be useful too. So that's a little backstory on the project itself. On the architecture, I know we've been going around with Rob and Lisa on materials and two-story, three-story discussions. And so I'll go through a couple things real quick, see how the screen sharing goes here. If I can find it. This never works as great as you think it will. Let's see. Maybe I'll just start clicking on some of these and see what I pull up. Interesting. I don't see what I'm looking for, but just go in here. Okay. Do you all see the rendering on the screen? Okay. It says my screen sharing is paused, but
We see a file system.
oh, then you're not seeing.
No, you're hovered over the PDF.
Oh, let me do it one more time here. See if that work. Does that?
No,
Oh,
we see.
yes.
That look right?
Mhm.
So a couple things about the design. Obviously, Front Street is a different animal than Main Street. And so if you look at the existing context, the sort of streetscape that we have is not real traditional. Most of the building facades along Front Street are new. And so there's a certain character on Front Street that's very different than Main Street. And so one of the things architecturally and just good design is you really want to look at the context in which you're designing. And so, we don't think it's appropriate. And certainly the design guidelines don't say that buildings should look like they're historic. Really, the design guidelines are more about massing, form, materials, and then the intent of trying to preserve the character of downtown. And we struggled during those workshops trying to define what the character of downtown really is. It's not a sort of a very traditional preserved historic district by any means. It's very eclectic. Buildings from the 50s, buildings from the turn of the century, buildings from the turn of this century. And so I think that the intent of the guidelines is really to make sure that new buildings don't overwhelm historic buildings, and that there's a place for both downtown, and that there's a respect for tradition as well as sort of the forward march of history, if you will. And so what we tried to do was to create a building for this little infill to replace the parking lot entry with something that would have a more detailed scale and massing than what you find on Front Street now. The building across the street, very large black stucco mass. 950 Spruce used to be the library, and we renovated it back to commercial. You know, it was a contemporary building, and you know we've kept that obviously as it is, but it has a larger footprint, and even though it is broken into smaller segments, still presents some large facades, especially on Spruce Street. So we felt that trying to break this down, that's why the three sort of townhomes are very much seen as three individual buildings, even though it really is built as one building, instead of a large block like you might do a commercial building with maybe a loft up on the third floor. One thing about the residential scale is that our floor to floor height isn't anywhere near as high as we do for commercial buildings. So, or we might have a 12 to 14 foot ceiling sometimes in commercial buildings. We really don't have the need for that. And in a compact residential building, it's hard to justify that from a cost standpoint. So we have 3 stories in what's essentially 35 feet. We called out a 36-foot height to make sure we've got room to adjust for, you know, as we work out the structure and the roof drainage and things like that. But basically what we're looking at is probably a building that's going to end up being about 35 feet, 35'6" at the most probably. And so that fits within the scale of many 2-story buildings. Again, as was pointed out, the building across the street is about 34 feet. The library, if you go to the corner where the elevator is on Front Street, is over 36 feet. And so a lot of 2-story buildings, State Mercantile Building, which I redeveloped, that front facade is 35 or 34 feet, I believe. The new building that we're doing down at the north end of Main Street for Barbie, that building is 34 to 35 feet, depending on where you measure it. Actually, I'd say it goes from 32 to 35 feet in different places. And so even in the transition zone, we can have 35-foot buildings. And so we're in an area where a 45-foot building with a tall first and second level could easily be 2 stories at 35 feet with a smaller third story. And the design guidelines were really written for commercial buildings and sort of the tradition of commercial buildings in the West, really, not just in Louisville. And so when you look at the ability to go 45 feet with the first 2 floors rising to 35 feet, it was important in the guidelines to have that third floor set back so that we didn't have 45-foot buildings rising from the sidewalk. And so when you present a 1 or 2 story facade at the property line, the front sidewalk that really is aimed at those buildings that could be 45 feet tall. And so we felt it was appropriate to limit the stories that meet the street, really not contemplating a project like this at all, where you would have shorter floor-to-floor heights. So the other thing that's in the design guidelines is materiality, and I I have to agree with Rob. We originally rendered this with some composite panels that are sort of a large panel. Um, if you look at the Trivium building up next to that historic landmark building on South Street and Front, it's panelized. It's got large flat panels of metal. So composite panel is sort of a generic name for different kinds of composites. That one was approved in this same design guideline process. And we felt that, you know, those kinds of materials can be used downtown, especially in a setting where we're surrounded by buildings that are really just featureless, you know, large plains of stucco is kind of what we have around us here. And so, but after looking at this, we actually went back to a design that we had originally, which was a horizontal siding for that lower part. And that, you know, that meets the letter of the design guidelines in terms of using a material type and scale that was used historically. Obviously, the building right next to us here has, you know, horizontal siding as well. And so I think, you know, we look at durability and maintenance as well as the aesthetic of the building. And so the composite panel really is a longer lasting material, doesn't require painting and so forth. So, but I think, I believe that the siding really does meet the letter and the intent of the design guidelines. And so we're happy to make that change. And I think that does improve the project at the street. One of the things that this project does entail is the first floor of these units basically has a large room that has a storefront glazing system, so that if somebody has a home office, a home business, they could do a live work scenario in these buildings. And our hope is that, you know, we might get some of that live work energy, somebody with a little gallery or a little business that can have a storefront and really help to, you know, enliven the streetscape with those kinds of small businesses along there. So that really is sort of the functionality of these spaces. Now, that's not to say that somebody can't use it as a spare bedroom or, you know, a den or rec room or whatever they want to use it for, but it is set up to be very conducive to some kind of a small retail use. So I do believe we meet the intent of the design guidelines. It says, I think, Gary, your question about that 3.3, it talks about present a 1 or 2 story at the property line. So these are 0 setback buildings, you know, that meet the property line. And so you can call it a 1 story, you can call it a 2 story. We've tried to sort of intimate with the balconies up here, a 2 story element that meets the street. And the 3rd story truly is set back from the street. So while we're 35 to 36 feet, we're not 35 to 36 feet at the property line. If you look at the library down the street, there's, you know, 36 feet rising straight up from the property line. So I think that when you really look at what we've done to try to you know, meet the intent of the code, we really have tried to do that by setting the 3rd floor back from the property line as is suggested in the design guidelines. Granted, you can see the full 3 stories, even though it's only as tall as a lot of the 2-story buildings. So I think that's the height question, I think, is really the one that probably deserves kind of the most attention. So this is a comparison, just a straight on elevation of the library building versus our elevation here. And again, this sort of pink box up here could be that if you can imagine this is a two-story building detailed the same as the library, you can imagine a third floor set back up to 45 feet. So that would be allowable in the code. And the reason it talks about setting that third story back is because it would be quite dominant if it were right up at the street edge. But again, our 35 feet doesn't even come up to the street edge. So again, we've tried to comply with that.
Hey, Eric, can
Oh,
you
yeah.
just hold on? I can't see that. Can everybody see what he's pointing
Oh,
to?
No, I was
you
gonna
You
can't.
might want to refresh that.
Yeah, sorry
It
about
sounds
that.
really interesting, but we,
It's fascinating. I wish you could see what I could see. How about that, guys?
Yeah.
All
There
right,
you go.
can you see that?
Yes.
Oh, good. I tell you, I have a problem with Zoom. It never switches screens when I do. So I'm not going to say it all again, but you can see the library here. It's 36 feet, probably a little higher, but generally speaking, this area of the building is around 36 feet. As you go up the street, the sidewalk rises up, so it's lower as you get by that parking lot on the north end of the library, probably around 34, 35 feet. So this shows you our building in a straight on elevation next to that. And as I was talking about, this sort of pink box up here rises to that 45-foot level. And it shows you the reason why you would set a third story on a large commercial building back from the street. So you don't have that 45-foot straight up from the street. Then if we go across the street on Front Street, then you see this is the building that we'll be facing directly. And it's about 34 feet from the sidewalk to the parapet. And again, this is a two-story building. So our building is going to be 1 or 2 feet higher than this building and set back from the street. But if you walk right up next to this building, then you can see the 34 feet, 34, 35, you know, I don't think anybody really can ascertain a difference of a foot or two in building height when you're looking at them from the street. You know, it takes all of us estimating these all day and then going out and actually measuring them to figure out how tall they really are. So, but that's a kind of a comparison that really I think is important. That, you know, these tall two-story buildings really are part of the fabric downtown, and they're not horrible. They're just fine. The fact that our building shows windows on 3 levels instead of 2 levels, does that make that building worse than this building, even given the fact that we've set our building back from the street? And I think that's really the question. What is the intent of the design guidelines, and have we met that intent? I think it's easy to get bogged down in the words in the design guidelines. And, you know, they were written over 20 years ago and probably should be refreshed. But we kind of use them as they're intended. If you look at the language, there's a lot of should and intent language in there as opposed to shall and must, you know, the kind of imperative language. So they really are trying to convey an intent of how to design buildings downtown that aren't going to overwhelm the existing fabric of downtown. And again, we want to contribute to it with things that are interesting, and that, you know, I wouldn't want to build another building, even though this would be legal, if if you will. I wouldn't want to build another building like that right across the street from it. I think this building is going to be much more interesting and have a lot finer grain of texture and detail than a lot of the buildings that you see. So that's really kind of the extent of what I wanted to present, and obviously want to answer any questions that you might have. But I do think that it is important to sort of understand that the design guidelines, we're looking at 45-foot buildings, and we're talking about a 35-foot building. So.
Okay, thank you for your presentation.
You bet.
Does anyone have any questions?
I have three. I have three questions. Eric, well, okay, I have two questions and a clarification. So, just to be clear, on the first story facade, the picture we're seeing now, you guys have already agreed that you wouldn't go that route. You would go with that, the horizontal.
That is correct.
Okay, just to clarify that. And then, I'm just curious about, and I don't know what the design, I can't imagine the design guidelines call out color, but I'm curious about the white there. Was there an intent to I don't, it seems like it stands out to me, and I can't decide if that's a good thing or a bad thing.
Okay. The white really was to give some relief. The buildings are fairly heavy,
Yeah,
especially
okay.
across the street, and
Yeah,
the library is a very massive, heavy building, and we really wanted to present something that felt a little lighter. It is a different kind of a use, and so we felt that differentiating it and not trying to make it look, we could have made it all brick and made it feel like it was a commercial building, tried to make it look more like the library or something, but we wanted it to really feel like, here's something that is different. It has a different use, different function. So.
okay. So my other question is how how deep is that porch? So you're at the property line, well, not porch, deck, whatever, on that third 2.5-ish, whatever that extra story is that we're debating. How far is that back? Is it 6 feet, 8 feet, 10
It's
feet?
about 7 feet back from the property line.
7 feet back from the property line. Okay. And then just one last question, and maybe this is a Rob question. So you were mentioning that you had designed these to have space that opens out onto Front Street that would have some mechanism for opening that could be used as a commercial gallery or whatever kind of space. When these, I'm just curious about the codes that are involved in that. Is that why this thing's coming in as a mixed use, or is the mixed use request based on the remodel of the second floor of the Fisher building?
It's a little bit of both.
Okay.
Primarily, we're adding residential, and the only way we can add residential is through the SRU.
Okay.
And so that makes it a mixed use project because we're keeping commercial on the first floor of 950 Spruce.
I guess my question is, and I don't know why I want to know the answer. It's maybe not relevant, but I'm just curious, like if I bought one of those and I did want to sell my wares out of that space in the lower that faces front, do I have to jump through any hoops to do that? Right? Or is it just already designated that I can live upstairs and do that downstairs? I mean, how does that work?
I'll let Rob answer the technical. Okay. My feeling, and I'm entitled to my feelings, right, Rob? is that the commercial use is already an approved use downtown. And so we don't have to do anything special to approve the commercial. The only thing that's not approved is residential. So we're getting the exemption, if you will, for the residential, but the commercial is the commercial. As a matter of fact, if these stop being residential for a period of time, then technically the code would make them turn into commercial spaces. So. Is that right, Rob?
Yeah, that's right. So if you get the special review use approved, and something odd happened and those went away and nobody was occupying them as a residence, or somebody converted them, I'd say the whole building to a commercial use, then it would no longer be allowed to be a residential use. And so that is something in our code. I don't think I think I think it's very, very unlikely that you would get an SRU approved for residential use and then it wouldn't be residential, at least in any near-term future that I can see for downtown. So, we do also have a live-work concept in the code that I'm less familiar with in our mixed use guidelines, I believe. But I think I would say my first thought is that absolutely, if you wanted to have a commercial storefront and convert it to a commercial storefront, you could do that, I believe, within current zoning, and then you wouldn't lose the residential use, the SRU.
Yeah.
I'd have to do a little bit more code research on that. I'm going to look through the code as you guys continue to talk, and if I see something more clear, I'll come back.
No, again, it was just like I said, I don't even know why I was asking. It was kind of a little bit more of a curiosity, like how many hoops someone would have to go through if they bought it and then they lived there. Like, I was just curious. It's not that important. So thank you, though.
Well, actually, it is important. I think somebody should probably open an ice cream store there, close to the street fairs for when they come back. I think that would be a good use.
You don't have to go to Sweet Cow.
Well, yeah,
Too far.
yeah.
So I have a question about this setback again, because Andrea was saying, so you said the second porch or second deck area, but my understanding, looking at because you were saying basically that the decks from the second and third story, those are at the property line, and then the building is actually set back. Is that what you were saying?
That's correct.
Okay.
That's correct.
So the decks are actually what's at the property line.
And
Does that
the
make
first-
sense, Andrea?
The first floor is at the property line. And then the
And-
second floor
okay.
deck is at the property line. And the third floor deck is at the property line.
Yeah.
But then the third floor building is set back. Can I share
Oh, it
again?
is set back.
Yeah.
Yeah, sure. That's what's tricky to see.
Yeah. Never comes up like I think it will. There. So the first floor, those storefronts, you guys can see this, right?
Yeah.
Right.
Yes. So the first floor comes out to the street like a standard storefront would. And then on top of that is a deck on the second level. So then the wall line of the second level and the third level is set back on the property line 7 feet.
But you still have, like, on the first floor. So that first floor, there's a little indent though, right?
Yeah. Yeah, it's about a foot, I think.
Yeah, so that's set back. So they're, yeah.
Yeah. Just to give you a place
So
to
it's not
stand.
set back as far as it looks like it is. Okay.
Correct. Yeah,
I
it's
think
pretty.
with the coloring, it looks like it's the same depth or same as the second story. So that makes sense. So it's only like a foot
Yeah.
in from the.
Let's see if I
Okay. Okay.
can here. There, you can see it's a very slight setback.
Okay. Sure. Yep. Okay.
And there's it's got a separate entrance. You can see that's a separate door.
Yeah.
For the commercial space from the residential is set back.
Mm-hmm.
Eric, I have a question.
Uh-huh.
This rendering that you're showing right now, and I see the horizontal sort of siding look in the white.
Yes.
Is this with the adjustment being made?
Yes, that's that is the horizontal siding
Okay.
change on the first floor.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then that deck, so just to be clear, so the Fisher building, it's just adding, like, where the awning ends, that's being added to a little bit as well. But right, for decks and whatnot for that.
Right over here, yes.
Yeah. And is that addition like that looks like composite too?
So,
But that doesn't match the original Fisher building, right?
actually, in the original renderings, it did not. It was the same color as the upper level here, but
Okay.
we've changed it so that it just blends in with
It
the
blends, okay.
original Fisher building stucco. So really, we have a real dividing line between the two now. We're not sharing materials at all. So,
Okay.
So it's not composite panel. It's just matching the existing stucco.
Oh, that will match. You won't
Yeah,
even know that that's kind of a new
correct. Yeah, we'll
thing
just
that
make it
happened in the
blend
back.
in.
Got it.
Right.
Okay. And then there's an alley walkway between.
That's correct. Yeah, right there you can see, you can walk back to, there's a rear door in the parking area.
Okay.
And so some of the residences that will be in the existing Fisher building, you'd enter that way. If you parked out here, you'd walk down through that alleyway, and then these decks are actually front porches for
Gotcha.
those residential units. And then you come in, and we're going to be changing some of these windows to make them operable. And there's a really slight change on the front, right around the main entry, where we're putting two kind of French balconies, so we can open up some sliding doors on the front of the building there, from the residential spaces.
But other than that, the Fisher building's not really changing.
No.
So all the changes are to the back.
Yeah, that's correct.
Any other questions? All right. And we'll open up to the public if there's any public comment or questions. And I don't see any. So we'll bring it back to discussion, for discussion with the commission. And again, this is a recommendation, so we don't have to vote, but probably giving general consensus of what we think about the project is what they're wanting.
So
That's Rob, we don't need to vote. This question.
Okay, yeah,
Maybe you wanna
so I think typically what we've been trying to do more recently is actually have a motion and a vote,
Okay.
because it's more clear in the record, I think, for
Okay.
future public hearings, and there could be
Okay.
conditions or requested changes. So yes, that'd be preferred.
Okay, so just more of an official consensus through a vote.
Yeah, I
Okay.
think you can somebody can make a motion to approve, not approve, or approve with potential conditions. You could also if you feel like you need more information, or something, you can always ask for more information if it's not available at this meeting and get it at the next meeting. That's always an option with any case as well.
and I'm sorry, there's 3 different pieces to this, yeah? Like one is saying we're okay or not okay with the mixed use thing, right? And then there's 3 different pieces.
No, so I think we pointed out the different types of the application, but we really try to focus the Historic Preservation Commission on the design guideline aspect.
Okay.
Especially anything that you think is particularly important as it relates to the traditional or historic character of downtown.
Okay. What? Nobody cares about our opinion on the other things? All right. I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding. Okay.
All right, so thoughts?
I had a couple of questions, maybe for staff. or all of us, that this, in a sense, it isn't really about historical preservation in a way. It's new development, but in a way that the city public take on the project is maybe more important. But I guess we can fill a role as reviewing it and, taking their point of view in it, even if it's not strictly historic preservation.
Well, and it's the historic context of downtown. So
Yeah.
it's how does it fit into our downtown historic landscape
Yeah.
is part of it too. So that's anything that happens downtown, they like to get our opinion
Yeah.
because it is our historic area. So right, so this building is clearly not historic, nor is much around it except for 740 front. But because there is historic property, there is context and it does affect that area. So that's what we're here for.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Oh, yeah. And all in all, I do think it's a thoughtful design. The other question is that often when there's work done downtown, there's a look at parking. And this reduces the amount of parking, but I think the original parking was private anyway. So I guess the city has looked at that and has no problem with that happening. Might be a little more alley traffic there. Might need one of those, convex mirrors or something. But maybe not. Maybe it's less traffic.
So just so you know, on the parking, so parking is something that gets reviewed with the PUD and the SRU, and we're still working with the applicant on the parking proposal. That with new development, you do need to provide new parking. There's different ratios in downtown than other commercial areas. There's an assumption of a lot of shared use and people walking and biking and taking the bus. So there's assumption of less need. So it's different than other commercial areas, but there's also an option in downtown to pay out parking because the city owns and maintains parking. So you do have to provide a minimum amount. You do, and then if you don't provide that minimum amount, you can pay into a city fund. So that'll be part of this project, but that's all still getting worked out.
Okay, thanks.
So I'll just jump in with talking about the height versus 3 stories. I think is a lot of what our discussion is, just as far as just the feeling of downtown and the code and all that. So clearly they could be higher. They could have taken it up to 45 feet. And I guess my discussion, because I'm not sure where I fall, but so our 2-story commercial buildings, that's what's most represented in downtown Louisville. So that's kind of our standard. And if there is a 3rd story, it's set back that whole piece. So the 2-story is our kind of standard and representative of downtown. And I think my question is, like the height issue is fine, but I guess I'm questioning, like, we don't have any residential downtown, and is a 3-story residential representative of Louisville? So I think that's where I'm kind of questioning. The mixed use piece, like I agree, like there's definitely historically been mixed use in downtown. And as far as like, the economic and all that kind of stuff, questions of what's the best use of the property isn't really up to us. But I think the question for me more is 3-story residential representative downtown Louisville. So, yeah. We do have some 3-story, and just to finish, we do have some 3-story commercial buildings downtown. You know, we have the one, what is that, Walnut in Maine, has that 3rd-story setback. So 3 stories has happened in Louisville. So it's not, so that's where I'm weighing in, is like, you know, we do have 3-story buildings, and 2-story is kind of our standard, and we do have residential downtown in the past, that is a 3-story residential characteristic. So that's just kind of what I'm thinking about.
I think, I liked the point that was made that it is ultimately the height of a tall 2-story. Obviously, it's 3 stories, but Front Street, as was stated, isn't very as much historic as Main Street. And all of this kind of main area is very eclectic in terms of its historical time periods. So that the fact that it's on Front Street and it does have the setback on the, from the, I don't remember how many feet it was, the porch at the top there. So I think it's trying to work within the intent of the downtown design handbook, but also offer, something that people would want to live in, a viable residential opportunity downtown.
Yeah, I agree. I think it seems like a thoughtful use. Now, Linda, the property you were mentioning, I think it's north of the barber shop. It wasn't the top level of that residential. Maybe they just had a umbrella out front or chairs or something and made it look like it. But I had thought that the top of that was residential, at least at one point.
I have no
It was,
idea.
no, it was not proposed as residential. It was all.
Okay. All right.
Just out of curiosity, I kind of forgot to ask this earlier. So yeah, if there is the 1-story structure that would be right to the south of this. That's not landmarked. Is that being used as residential right now, or is that commercial?
I think it might be mixed use, but I
Right,
think it's
but
commercial.
so this structure and the gas station, it's the little one in between it.
The little greenhouse.
Yeah.
There's definitely some commercial uses in there.
Okay.
There might be some residential in there still existing too. It's definitely an eclectic group of buildings back there.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I looked. It was listed for sale a while ago. I don't know if it still is, but they definitely had commercial, but also they listed it, and it looked like some residential in there as well. So.
Yeah, so there's I'm just trying to picture it. There's a couple of other.
Right, there's the main house kind of faces front, and then it goes back, almost like a hotel kind of style. It goes back and forth.
Yeah. Okay.
I think there's 3 separate like spaces back there, or in the property, like 3 separate.
Yeah.
They're all connected, but 3 separate entrances and spaces. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess I'm feeling a little bit torn. My gut reaction is that I'm more concerned about the height than how many stories it is, right? There's a bunch of hobbits living in there and it's 8 stories, whatever. Like, you know what I mean? Like, I don't know. The whole story thing just didn't really, I'm like, yeah, it needs mass and scale of what's going on around it. Granted, there's that little tiny house next door, and then we have our little tiny, restaurant. But everything else around it is that height. So, my gut inclination was it's a thoughtful design. They did try to push it back a little bit so it isn't 35 feet, just overwhelming, the front of the streetscape as you walk by. There was some, thoughtful use of color and, materials, breaking it up to not be a giant mass and to be a little bit more residential leaning. But that said, Linda, you brought up a good, or Chair Haley, you brought up a very good point. Like, you know, what are you opening the door to, kind of thing, I guess, maybe. With a third, you know, with 3-story residential.
And just 3 stories from the front of the street too. Yeah.
Say that again.
Well, just that there's it's set back, but it's not the 3rd story isn't like a far like
Right.
set back. You know, like it's
Right.
set back by a it's set back, but it's just kind of yeah, it's just a little more obvious and definitely 3 stories. So, and I think, I mean, visually, there is visually something different between 3 stories and 2 stories. Like, even though it's the same height, it is busier for your eye.
Yeah.
It's a great design. Like the building, I have no issues with the actual design of the building. I
Yeah.
think that's the only kind of historic, contextual kind of piece is just in design review kind of piece that I can,
Yeah.
I don't know. But I don't have a strong opinion either way. It's just something I think is worth considering for long term, just how the city might go at any given point in the
Right.
future.
So
do you have any? Go ahead, Andy. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
well, I am just, I guess now I am wondering, like in the picture that Rob showed us way at the beginning from the National Handbook or whatever, how, I mean, this is set back 7 feet. Like, what's the magic number? Right. Like if it were straight up commercial, let's forget the residential piece. If it were straight up commercial, what would that number be? If it's not 7 feet, is it 10 feet? Is it 12? Like, is that up in the air based on?
Yeah, I don't know if there is a magic number.
Do you want me to try to answer that question per the handbook? Because there is some specificity in the handbook.
Oh,
and again,
yeah.
it's not a shell in the handbook, but it is very specific on that point. Let me just get there. So I think it's C6. So, and again, it's not okay, this many feet. It says the 3rd floor should be set back substantially from the sidewalk edge such that the building will appear to be 2 stories in height as seen from across the street.
Oh.
So there is this view corridor concept where, from directly across the street. And so when you had the terraces project, which you were talking about, which is just north of the Huckleberry, there was consideration of, how those view planes would interact in that commercial building. So that's what it says in our design guidelines. It's as viewed from across the street. It would appear as a 2-story building. So I think that is not going to happen here if you're considering all 3 stories versus the height. I think if you're thinking it's within the intent of the guidelines, you're probably going to want to say, hey, it's either, this is 35, 36 feet, which is that's the height of a tall 2-story building. So maybe we're okay with it from that standpoint. Or it provides enough massing at the front, either through the brick element versus the stucco on top, or that white panel and deck, like that provides some 1 and 2 story massing. So I think there's 2 ways to see it. But that's what the design guideline says as far as how you measure it.
Okay. Hmm.
Keith, did you have anything on this? Any thoughts?
Yeah, what I was just going to say, add a few elements everybody else said. I think to me, it's not about 2-story versus 3-story. It's more about the relative heights. If it's no higher than the rest of the buildings around it, it's not going to stand out and be an eyesore. And as a matter of fact, the design is very pleasing visually, I think. And I also think the multi-use aspect is a efficient use of space downtown, and it'll bring more vitality down there. So I really like the design. I think it may not meet the exact letter of the code, but I think it fits within the guidelines. That's my opinion.
All right. Um, so the code, just to go back to what Rob read, the 3rd story should be set back enough that it can't be seen from across the street. So I don't know how, I don't know what like if we have a perspective like from a street, like a sidewalk perspective, like I don't know how accurate this is for what it looks like directly across the street. I'm guessing you can
Well,
see all 3.
I'm not sure he said he can't be seen. I think he said that it appears like a 2-story.
Right. Well, and if it appears as a 2-story, would that mean you couldn't see the 3rd story? I don't know.
Sure.
Yeah.
So Chair Haley, I don't know if that was a question about clarification. So if that was to my statement, I wasn't stating that you couldn't see it. You absolutely could see the 3rd story.
Okay.
I think from across the street, the way it's designed, I don't think there's an attempt at this point to meet that letter of the code to that specificity.
But that is in our code.
It's
Ideally,
in
you
the,
would not be able to.
yeah, it's in the design guidelines, and it's a should statement. So I think there isn't, unfortunately, these aren't all these standards. Yeah, there's nothing that says if you check all these boxes, you meet the design standards. Unfortunately, it's a lot more interpretation. So it's a very specific standard. It doesn't have to be met in order to support it, but it's an important consideration. You could choose either way based on all of the other aspects of the design that might be influencing how it fits within the character of downtown.
Okay, thank you for that clarification. I mean, the other piece, looking at the building across the street from this, there's the third story of the proposed residential would be pretty minimal. I mean, they have like 3 openings on the third story. So there's a lot less openings than the one across the street. I mean, that's not even a code thing, you know, but just as far as
Right.
the busyness and the, um, I mean, that's something to consider too. Maybe it's visually not as, that third story is not as noticeable because there's not many openings. Like it just looks like a sliding glass door that comes out, but it's not like it's, you know, solid windows. Um, and then the second story, half of the openings are kind of obstructed um, by the deck railing, so they're not even completely visible. So, I mean, that might be something to consider too, whether or not it's not just lines and lines of windows for 3 stories, you know, or openings. So,
Right. Yeah, I mean, I don't know. It's yeah, it's kind it is a very tricky situation, right? Because like certainly in other western towns, you know, you see this all the time, right? Like big 2-story right buildings that were once completely commercial are now commercial on the bottom, residential on the top, right? Um, and that this building certainly would have that feel, even if it's totally residential. It the way they designed it onto the street, it still kind of has that feel to it, right? That it's commercial as you're walking past it on the streetscape, um, which is yeah. So for me, I don't know. I guess that's why I'm not super bothered that it's 3-story residential, but I am cognizant of, yeah, is it a slippery slope from here on out then, right?
I like that I like that these units have the opportunity to be mixed use. And I do think that is more authentic historically in downtown areas. And I think it would just bring, yeah, more potential for vitality to downtown. And especially as, you know, real estate now might not be used for a while commercially again. So I like that it's going to have opportunity for both. You know, right? It's 3 stories. We don't really maybe ideally want 3 stories downtown, but it's done well. So I guess, you know, it's just establishing a precedent that
Right.
we don't want, but it is done really well. I think I like the design a lot. I think it works and could really be a great addition to Front Street.
mhm. Yeah, and I don't have an issue with the design at all, but I think, like Andrea said, like it's more of that, like traditionally it's commercial on the bottom and then living up top with like just the 1 story extra, like it's a 2 story. So that's, and I think too, looking at it again, I don't know, like does the second or the third story deck like make it even that much more obvious that it's a 30 story, you know? I don't know. I have no that's and that's the thing, like I have no idea. I have no issue with the design. Like I think it's a beautiful building, like it's great. Um, but um I don't know, like it's just is that in character with, and obviously this is our newer area, like library is not, you know, it's a new building. Fisher is a new building, the one across next to 740 is a new building. Like
Yeah.
this is not a historic area, so it really is just the 3 story versus 2 story for me. I don't know. So I don't mind. The mixed use is fine, like all of that. But like on the
I
other side of the railroad tracks, like in the new development, there's 3 story residential there. They're amazing. They're great. They serve a purpose. Like that whole piece. So there's this part of me that's like, do we need to like, do we bring that into our new downtown as, you know, do we bring new elements like that into our downtown, or do we keep that space downtown true to what we've had historically? So that's, I don't know, that's just where I'm hung up on. I don't know. It seems like such a silly thing. Like it's the right height. It's, you know, creative. It's going to be economically just more versatile. Like all those things are awesome. They're great. And so I don't know. Gary, what are your thoughts on this? You haven't spoken in a while.
Well, I guess I'm unmuted. Yeah, I agree with what a lot of you have said, that I think it's a nice design. It's thoughtful. It doesn't jump out as being an outrageous three-story building that doesn't match everything else. The height is in line. I guess the only reservation I would have is that in the future, if somebody did want to push the limits and say, well, you already put in a three-story building, mixed use, and therefore we should be able to do that. But I guess as long as the city's guidelines are remain the same, then we can always have this discussion on any future property proposed. So anyway, overall, I like the design. I think it, as Keith pointed out, it brings a lot of advantages.
Do we want to make a motion? Do we want to make a referral recommendation?
I would move that we approve this. Is it a PUD or a SRA?
Yeah.
SRU.
I would just recommend that if you want to make a motion for approval, that you move that the commission finds that it's consistent with the downtown design handbook standards.
Okay. I would
Might,
recommend.
you might, I don't know if I'd phrase it consistent with as more,
Allowable with, or
yeah,
Complies.
the intent or something, because it's
Yeah, there you go.
not exactly, you know what I mean? It's not consistent to the letter, and we're recognizing it's not consistent to the letter, but we believe the intent, it doesn't blow the intent of the handbook out of the water. I don't know how you want to say it.
That's a technical term.
Yeah, I think play around with the language, but just that it's, the point is that your focused review is on that historic and traditional context based on the design handbook. So if that's the motion.
Do you want to make the motion again, Gary?
Uh,
To include that
it's more
language?
complicated now.
I know. Do you remember what they said?
Yes, I would move that we approve this in the spirit of compliance with the design guidelines. Maybe that's enough, and staff could draft the formal report that goes forward, or the formal resolution.
I would second that motion.
And just so you know, we don't do resolutions on these. So basically
I
your
see.
minutes will stand as the record for the Planning Commission City Council.
Okay.
So it'll show your discussion and that you made a motion to approve it. And I think it'll be clear in the motion what your intent is.
Yeah, okay.
I think.
And Chrissy seconded it.
Second the motion.
All right, we'll do a roll call.
Commissioner Keller,
Yes.
Commissioner Berg,
Yes.
Commissioner Clemmy,
Yes.
Commissioner Dunlap,
Yes.
Chair Haley.
I'm gonna say no. So, but it still passes. So, all right. All right. So our next item is items from staff during our discussion and direction on our HSA requirements. This is something we brought up last month, and we were going to revisit because we felt like there's probably more to it than what we were ready to talk about. So,
Right. Good evening, everyone. I'm going to share my screen before you, just to have a little bit up there just as a reference. As Chair Haley noted, we talked a little bit about this at our last meeting, but since there were some follow-up questions, staff did do some more additional research and wanted to go ahead and present that to you this evening. So as you can kind of see in those 1, 2, 3, 4 numbers in the summary before you, those were some of the questions that I had taken down as what it sounded like we wanted to follow up on, or at least get more in details about. And so that's what is outlined in the memo before you this evening. So for the first question, where some of the commission had asked, what are other communities doing? Does it look like what we're doing? Do other communities have something very similar? And if so, what does that look like? And so I did do some research of a couple communities, including Greeley, Denver, Fort Collins, and Longmont, and then kind of more of specifically, and then more of a broader research. And so overall, what I found was it doesn't look like that there's any other Colorado CLG that does exactly what we do. And by that, I mean offer our own city-funded grant funds that would allow somebody to do the HSA and receive funds. Everyone that I found, and at various levels, and what I mean by that is certainly the cities before you that I mentioned, but also historic Denver, and kind of a nonprofit entity as well, all do, as far as I found, point to the same state grant that we've talked about before. And so without going too quickly over this, I did just want to go down so you can see what I'm seeing and see that it's specific. But what the state offers is what I'm highlighting here is, so just to give you that funding amount, is the state does offer it, as we've talked about. It would be a grant. You can apply for it at any time. That's what it looks like for them in terms of a rolling grant, just like ours is, and for instance, not a certain date of time of year or something like that. And they offer a maximum of $10,000. You can see there's sort of a caveat or an additional amount that could be applied for if deemed appropriate or necessary by the person applying or persons applying. But one thing I wanted to note, and just in general that I think it's good to keep in mind, only for reference and nothing necessarily else, is that a lot of times at the state level, it could be a bigger building, or sometimes even a set of buildings, right? A historic district, or I'm thinking particularly in Colorado, some of our western communities that maybe it's a, series of ranches or an old farm, farm community. So that's just something to keep in mind. So why it might be a little bit higher, but you can see we're kind of close to that even with our 4,000. Not saying, in any way, shape, or form, but just nice that the numbers are kind of there. And so again, I don't want to scroll too much, but I wanted to just note that that there was the specific amount there. So that was kind of what I felt was one of the questions I wanted to talk about. I'm scrolling back up now just to show you the questions again. And so some of the other ones that we talked about, or that I gleaned from our conversation last month, was that, so we've obviously noted we've obviously noted that SHPO, the state's Historic Preservation Office, certainly has their own grant, and that's what a lot of these other communities or groups or et cetera point to. And so then what are their requirements? Kind of what do they ask for when they have submissions, or when they're, saying, hey, we've given you this set amount of money, here's what we're kind of looking, when we review the HSA we've received in order to get that money. And so that's the one question we did some research on. And then also, do other communities or the SHPO's office, of course, require a structural assessment? So that's what I wanted to talk about here. And to scroll back down to give you some of that verbiage before you. So the kind of short answer is, in a large part, it looks like we're pretty much in line with them. And I think that's something we touched on a little bit last time, is that, we essentially borrowed their guidelines or their kind of processes for our process, right? So we kind of say, here's what we want to see inside of the actual HSA itself, matches specifically with what the SHPO's office does do. Like them, we do not require specifically a structural engineer, though they and us would say a structural engineer could certainly be on the project, of course, as we've seen, but they could also lead the project or they could be a part of the project lead as long as there's an architect also on the project. So saying that, if there is a structural engineer kind of heading it up, in essence, the state and thus we do at this time require that at least a licensed architect by the state of Colorado has to be a part of that project as well. So you get that expertise as part of the, report or end outline. And then in terms of a little bit more specifics, the bullet points you can see here that I'm sort of highlighting, those are some of the specifics that they list on their website as part of the grant, requirements of who can do it. And you'll notice that that's very similar to ours. We've pulled our language from this as well, adjusted it so it can meet, our needs as opposed to state needs or some things like that, but very similar to kind of what they would offer overall or ask for overall, pardon me. And then the last bullet point here that I'm sort of highlighting now is also, okay, so once they get the application, they get the grant funding, what does it look like in terms of the draft application, or sort of speaking to the question I know we all spoke about last month of how do we kind of look at what we've received? Is it good information? Is it whole information? Does it give us the whole picture? Those sorts of questions. And that second bullet point there, it looks like as far as how we do it now, should it, we want to continue that process, but the SHPO's office has a very similar process as we do in the sense that they say, once you apply for the grant, we will ask you to show us who's going to be kind of working on it, and then also send a draft into us. We will review it. We'll have comments. We offer the comments to you, and then we would ask those comments to be addressed in the final submission back to us, and then it's accepted. So as of now, just so how it stands, we do have a very similar process in which a draft application a draft HSA is submitted to staff. Staff reviews it, offers comments or additional points of clarification, and then that final the final HSA is sent back with those comments in mind. So either changed or addressed or answered or so on. So that's kind of the general rundown there. And then I talked about this a little bit already, but for if they would, does the state require or other communities require structural engineer? The sort of short answer would be no as well, right? Looks like most of the communities don't have the same, scenario that we do. So they ask people to go ahead and for their HSA apply to the state, and the state would have those requirements, which are sort of set forth, but do not require a structural engineer to be on the project, only that they could be a part of it, or if they are on the project as the kind of top, the top consultant, then an architect also has to be on it. So to clarify, if just an architect's on it, that's okay. Structural engineer wouldn't have to be part of it, but if it's the roles reversed, a licensed architect would. And that's sort of in line, just to take a step back. Certainly, obviously, we wanted to make sure that the structure of a building that's being assessed is assessed, but the sort of with that is they want to make sure that the Secretary of the Interior standards are being addressed as well. And often, not that a structural engineer couldn't, but often an architect might be more well-versed in that sort of language or rhetoric or knowledge or things like that. So that's just kind of where that might come from. And then the last question that we kind of brought back before you, wanted to clarify, and certainly others can be clarified tonight as well, was, who do we have a list, and kind of what does that list mean, and what does that look like? And so I'm going to scroll down to that as well. We have on our list of the info packet that's available to residents or whomever would want to apply. You can see down here. Pardon my scrolling, but just to show you the list here, we do have a professionals list, and this is just people who we know have done the work, would qualify, meet the requirements of being a licensed architect, for instance. And so we have a list of them. We do have a note on our website and in the info packet that this certainly isn't, the city making any recommendations. It's just a list to help people find somebody. And then we also offer the state's list, who has an entire list of consultants that's much longer than this and would include, carpenters and other people, but HSA consultants would be on that list as well. So if we also guide people to that so they can kind of make their own decision but finding someone who we know is qualified, we offer that and the state offers that, and we offer both. So I'll kind of leave it there. I don't want to talk too much, and if there's other questions, I want to make sure I address those. But those were certainly the ones that I'd written down and made and starred to make sure that I kind of did some research on and came back to clarify this evening. And so, like I said, I'll kind of leave it there. And then if you all have any questions or comments or anything like that, I'm happy to talk about that as well. So I'll stop sharing my screen just so we can all see each other, but I can certainly pull that back up too.
All right, thank you.
Mhm.
And the SHPO grant, you said it was $10,000, and then you could also apply for an additional $5,000 if you needed that. And is that for residential or commercial or just anything?
To my knowledge, it would be either. The sort of qualifying, and I'm scrolling back up to that point, the sort of qualifier there would be they ask you to prove, probably isn't the right word, but they basically, in your part of your application process, they say if you're asking for this additional 5,000, you have to state why and kind of give a compelling case of. Usually they'll say you have to kind of show that there is you can kind of tell that there is structural issues, and so right off the bat or from the beginning, that you're going to want extra money or want that specific kind of focus. So you have to apply that or apply for it that way. So yeah, it would be 10,000, and then you could up to an additional 5. But again, you would kind of have to prove the need, as it were.
Right. Well, I was just thinking that because ours is 4,000, so that's much less than 10,000 for residential. And I think last month we were talking about what is are professionals just charging us the full amount because it's there, or is that truly how much these cost, for everything? And so with SHPO having the 10,000, I'm just curious, that's significantly more than what we offer. So yeah, that's just interesting. So I think our main question was, do we want to, do we want to require a structural engineer? And this looks like, for the state, they really don't.
Correct.
So, and if they are potentially offering more without without requiring that additional structural engineer, maybe we're fine. What do you guys think?
Our original discussion was, it seemed like every time there was an HSA, then a grant, there was a request for extraordinary circumstances. And it turned out that in most of those cases, we should have done structural engineering and maybe had an idea with it up front. But I really, well, for starters, I really appreciate the work that Kim did in putting this together and then the other discussion item. I think it's very thorough and it really helps. I like the wording that Denver had put in, where they said you should construct a structural engineer with historic building experience of a building, if a building shows evidence of structural issues such as cracks, building movement, and things like that. And that's probably a good way to state it. There was a HSA done on a 60s era building up by the middle school. And, just at first glance, there would have been really no reason to compel structural engineering for that one. So to make it optional, but to have it called for if the architect sees that coming would be a good thing.
Mm-hmm.
At the time we originally discussed this too, before we had the new 4,000 limit for the residential HSA. In one of the breakdowns of cost, the cost of adding a structural engineer was under $1,000, and maybe it was 600 or something like that. So it really wouldn't blow the limit out of the residential and commercial amounts that we have, I think, if that needed to happen. So anyway, maybe there's a good way to state that. Make it optional, but make clear that it's asked for, or if it's needed. Yeah, there's that in italics is that Denver recommendation.
Well, and I think the draft have like requiring that a draft be submitted before the final, and having that caveat of it's very possible we may need if there's some obvious things that we need clarification on, or structural things are hinted at or seen in the draft, we may require that you do get an HSA, a structural engineer, like maybe just putting some of that verbiage in. But I think requiring the draft might alleviate the requirement for the structural engineer. Because then staff would kind of be that point of saying, yeah, the commission's probably going to want a structural engineer on this, or yeah, this looks pretty straightforward and we should be good. So, Kim, do you feel like that would be a good catch point for that, or?
Yeah, so you're sort of saying, well, Gary was kind of saying, let's have that sort of in the info packet in that sort of initial stage. And then as well as when staff is reviewing, keeping an eye out to say, are those structural needs that are they obvious in this? And then are they addressed is kind of a twofold question. And I think certainly, I would think setting it up in that sort of info packet or at the beginning stages to say, this is something we'd look for if needed, as well as then looking for it, being specific when we do our draft reviews, is certainly something we could incorporate, no problem.
Right.
Yeah, I think that's reasonable. I think most homeowners would have a pretty good sense if they're dealing with drainage issues, foundation issues. I think they're going to have a reasonable sense that that's what they're up against. And we know then those always end up in these extraordinary circumstance cases. So just getting that up front. And then I think we also talked about maybe getting some better numbers, because that's been an issue too. It's one thing for the structural engineer to say, yeah, your foundation's a mess, yada, yada, yada. But then we get these numbers and, I don't know. It seems like the numbers sometimes don't always come back, or something. I don't know.
Like the estimates.
The other thing I wanted to say about that, and I guess this is my frustration, not just as a commission member, but a general taxpayer, is that, okay, so everybody's being offered $4,000, and somehow all the invoices are for $4,000, and sometimes they've used a structural engineer and sometimes they haven't. Well, how can that be? That makes no sense to me. I'm like, well, yours should be 600 less or 900. You didn't use a structural engineer. So why is your HSA, why is everybody billing us $4,000? So that's still a big hot point for me, obviously. Like getting the billable hours. Like, I don't want just an invoice with the total amount. Like, I want to see the billable hours. The architect spent X hours at this billable rate, and the structural engineer spent X hours at this billable rate, or whatever, right? And then, yeah, to the point that the state is offering $10,000, here's what I'm picturing. I'm picturing like massive buildings, right? I'm picturing they're trying to restore their old high school in their town, right? Like a big, not I'm like a big, high school that they're trying to convert to a museum, like Golden converted their high school, right? Their old high school got converted into the Mountaineering Center and a bunch of offices. Or in Golden, they're trying to salvage the Olinger Mortuary building downtown that's just, looks like it's going to go any day now. I mean, that's so for 10,000, that's what I'm picturing that $10,000 goes for, is like that kind of thing. Not one of our, you know, 800 square foot, our cute little 800 fair, the houses that we love so much, right? So,
Right, and that was my question too, is the 10,000 for residential all the way up to huge projects? And I guess too, like how, obviously they don't pay 10,000 to every single applicant or recipient, and so how do they decide how much each structure
Oh.
gets? Like, is it just a billable, like, okay,
yeah.
so you have a $900 HSA, and this person has a $3,000 HSA, and we look at the billable hours, and maybe they're just more. I don't know. Like it's just it's a very big number for. Yeah, yeah. I think it's a good point, Andrea, because I mean that is part of our role too, is to be stewards of the money of the fund, and so we do have to. And I think that's why we want to make sure we're getting our money's worth. Like if we're paying $4,000. Should we be paying $4,000? What are we getting for $4,000? And what are we getting? And yeah, I think it's a valid question. Yeah, I don't, because Denver, this is to you, Kim, because Denver doesn't really break it down as to how they allocate the money or figure out building to building or anything.
Yeah, I didn't see if you're kind of asking about, for Denver specific examples or specific kind of monies that you could see. I didn't see any sort of, here's some we've seen in terms of what the state's offered or anything. I haven't seen that, if that's your
I
question.
meant SHPO. I meant SHPO. I'm sorry.
No, that's
SHPO
okay.
was I'm sorry. So SHPO was the $10,000. And so how does SHPO decide, like, this Denver project gets X amount of dollars for their high school, and this small 400 square foot home gets X number of money for their grant?
Right.
Yeah,
Yeah.
they didn't have what they do have. I don't want to misspeak where I might not know, but one thing that I think is, when I was researching, that I think is relevant here, is that they do ask for a scope of work. So they'll ask you, as kind of part of the application process.
Okay.
So that could be the point in which they've said, for instance, right, hey, we've seen cracks in our foundation, so we know for sure we'd like a structural engineer, or something to that effect. One thing is we could research and see how to fit something like that into our process. I know that one thing we talked about last time was, we don't want to necessarily make it too burdensome to help encourage people to kind of apply for the grant, but to these points, how do we make sure, these things are getting spent right? So one thing I could look at, and I don't necessarily have anything tonight, but I could see how we might incorporate into the application process, because certainly we do have an application process, and we come before you for the probable cause and say, here's how we think it meets the sort of landmarking requirements, and here's the history that we know so far. So we do kind of have some sort of vetting process. It's a little more history based, but we could sort of see how, that it's still amenable and helps encourage people to apply for it, but also gives you a little bit more information on the front end. That's difficult. I don't know exactly what that looked like, right? Because in part, sometimes that's what the HSA does, is gives us that larger picture and says, hey, here's what's going on in the rafters or something like that. So it might be a little difficult, but that could be one way. And I see Rob's popped on, so I'll also pop to him.
Well, I was just wondering, listening to this, if you would like to just require that probable cause applicants include in their application a proposal from the architect that they're going to hire. I don't know how often that happens, that they've already hired an architect. It's probably most of the time, So we could just add to the application list, what's their proposal, what's the cost, what's the scope, and then you can see and again, it's just an idea. Again, I think most of them probably have architects already involved, but not always. So we're probably going to frustrate a few people who said, well, I don't even know. I don't know. I haven't hired someone yet. I just want to know if I can hire someone. So we're going to run into that. That's kind of the con of doing it that way. But to me, that's maybe the best way for you all to have really specific oversight, is to force people to do that up front.
So to get a, go ahead.
I was just going to say, a few people may not do it, who are really, who just can't tolerate that additional level of, of doing it, of that additional level of having to apply and jump through that hoop. But
Well, and some people that are doing probable cause aren't necessarily planning on doing any work on their house either. I mean, they might. I guess most are though. I mean, but there's always a chance that some might not be.
I would say there's a chance that some people have very little intention of landmarking, and they just want to maybe get some money to do an assessment of their home, and there, there's probably some chance they'd maybe landmark, but they probably mostly had their mind made up. But maybe that's the point too, is you get that little crack in the door, and it leads them down a different path.
I think some of the people who had historically landmarked their houses, they love the idea. Their ancestry was from Louisville. They're part of an Italian family or a French family, and they just really liked the idea of landmarking their house. And it really didn't involve a lot of work or rehabilitation at all. So we don't want to chase those people away.
But they don't have to use the HSA, right? They can.
So right. So there's kind of. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Chair Haley.
Well, I was just going to say, because to Rob, I said there's some people that would maybe want to do probable cause, but not necessarily be intending to change their house. But I think that's actually probably not as true as people that truly just want to landmark and don't necessarily want to do anything on their house. So I think that would be, to Gary's point, of there's certain people that want to landmark but have no interest in adding on or changing anything. And so they don't have to get an HSA. You can landmark and never use your HSA or grant money.
Right. Yeah.
Right?
You don't have to apply for that.
For those that are doing probable cause, they're usually the ones that are like, I bought this house, or I've been in this house for a while, and what could I do? Like, could I, scrape? Could I add on? What are some of the landmarking? So those are the people that are like, let me just explore my options. And that's why we did this in the first place, was like Rob said, to get that crack in the door of like, we'll pay for your HSA if you'll have a dialogue with us. So anyway, that's all I was going to say, was I think there are people that just want to landmark, and to Gary's point, it wouldn't scare them away because they don't have to talk to an architect. They don't have to do an HSA. They can just landmark their house and be good to go. So that's all I was going to say. Were you going to add on to that, Ken?
Nope, I was just going to mention that there's that landmarking piece. So we do require the probable cause kind of either route, but yeah, that from the start, they could get the HSA monies, but certainly wouldn't have, they wouldn't have to elect to do that if they didn't want to, if they only wanted a landmark.
Right. Yeah.
So we're kind of debating, so that the application would say there'd be like an additional section. Who's your architect? Please submit the scope of work. Right. Then that would include some of the architects, like, yeah, we're going to look at it. We're going to use a structural engineer, or we're going to look at it. We think it's just exterior trim or whatever. That's kind of what we're debating, right? And then how much they think their HSA would cost. based on that? And we see that
Should we
with
ask
the
them?
probable cause? Is that kind of what we're thinking?
Would the proposal include the price of how much their HSA would cost? Robin, Kim, is that part of the proposal?
Yeah, I think that would be key to getting the information that you want. So it'd be the scope, but also their cost proposal. So you'd be approving a specific
Yeah.
amount.
Well, we don't give grant money any other way. I mean, the other grant money, you have to tell us what you're gonna spend it on up front, right? Like 70,000 for the foundation and 15 for the trim. And I mean, we make them do that on all the other money we pass out. So
Yeah, so right. So if, say somebody gets $10,000 for a foundation, so we get an invoice for $10,000 from a contractor that says paid for foundation work, right? So we're and to be frank, we don't know what a foundation repair costs. We're not out
Right.
there comparing it to other scopes of foundation work.
Yeah.
So so I just want to be clear on kind of what's happening, and if you want another
Yeah.
level of somebody looking at cost of work, we could get into that too.
Oh no, I guess Rob, I was just saying, like, when we're here and someone is asking for a matching grant, right? They give us the numbers, right? Like and they're not always right, but they're like, we're gonna ask for $30,000 because we know we need to move this window and we need to do this and this and this, and then we're like, okay, and then maybe the window costs a little bit more and the roof costs a little less, but at the end of the day, they submit you guys to the city, and the city, gives the grant money. So I guess my point is, I don't think it's asking too much of applicants to have an architect, and the architect says, if I'm going to do an HSA on this 800 square foot house, this is what I'm going to do, and it's going to cost X. And then the architect turns around a month later and does a different one and says, here's what I'm going to do on this one, and I think it's going to cost Y because it's a 2,000 square foot house, right? I don't think that's asking too much in the application process.
Kim put it in terms of a scope of work, and maybe
Right.
then we've laid out several steps, but one would be to have that scope of work, and then it'd be possible to differentiate those. I guess I don't think it has to be spelled out in the HSA, but to have those steps internally that we lead them through probably helps to get to where we want. An understandable request for an HSA.
Hmm. So if we are, I guess, we're not revamping our HSA, but we're just require making additions. I don't know how we say this, but so one thing sounds like we would say like that we want a proposal like as part of the application for a probable cause. You would also submit a proposal from your architect for your scope of work. That'd be one thing we require. And then we'd also just lay out the steps as far as needing a draft and that draft being reviewed by staff. And then would there be anything else that we'd want to add to this? Those are the two things we've kind of talked about.
Can we back up a sec? I think I lost you. So
Yeah.
when we're asking in the revised application process, when we're talking scope of work, we're talking the scope of work of what the architect and or structural engineer are
Proposes they're
doing,
gonna
or what they're going to look at versus, okay. versus
Right,
what
so
we
the
need, the scope of work of what's gonna be done, right? It's the scope of work of their jobs, right?
as far as what's relevant to the HSA, is that right?
So,
Rob's
so the
coming
So
in.
the HSA, Kim, correct me if I'm wrong, the HSA has has to be included, right? So I think what you're going to be reviewing, so I'm pretty sure they're all going to come back and say, we're going to do this, which is in so we know what the scope's going to be. I think the difference that you're going to want to see is who are they hiring as sub-consultants? Are they hiring a structural engineer?
Okay.
And therefore you're going to say, oh, well, our last HSA was only $2,000. Why is yours 4? What's your, what is this more complex for some reason?
Right.
Or, oh, are you hiring a structural engineer and that's why it's more than our last one? So you're going to be able to kind of vet that ahead of time. So I think that's more important than the scope of what's included, because that's pretty standard.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
And just to confirm, that's right. We have the guidelines that are laid out. That's what we look for in the HSA itself, that are, a couple pages long and pulled from the state. So that tells them what we need to see in the report itself. So it wouldn't be that, just to confirm.
Right. And so the proposal, when I say proposal, that's basically the money that they're planning to charge the client to do all the work that they're going to do. So it's line by line, this house has this specific crack or these foundation issues that we think might be an issue, or drainage or whatever. They're line iteming those things so that they know the price point of like how much it's going to cost to have that looked at in a more thorough way for those specific issues. So that would be the monetary piece, where it's ahead of time. We're seeing what are they planning to look at and to have their their expertise on, basically, before it's already done and we're like, oh, it's $4,000. Okay, so I think that proposal piece, right? That proposal piece just puts it into check ahead of time of like, what are you doing? How much is it going to cost? And then and then with the draft, that comes back through staff and they can see, does this line up with their proposal? Is this, do they look at everything that they were supposed to? Is it thorough? Are the or is the step-by-step that's laid out in the HSA, do they meet all those criteria? And once all those are checked off, then staff can say, okay, this was fine, and we can grant this money of however much it is, $4,000 or whatever. So those are the two things: is the monetary proposal, like the bid, basically, and then just requiring that they submit a draft before they turn in their final. But those are the two things. Was there anything else that we wanted to put in there?
No, those are good. The statement earlier that Denver had put in theirs, where they said consult a structuring engineer, or a structural engineer if there are any signs of cracks and things like that. A statement like that might make it clear at the time of the HSA that there's a case for having one and not having one, and so therefore there's a difference in the cost of the overall evaluation. I mean, maybe it's obvious that they should bring in a structural engineer if you need one, but if you call it out, then you're also making a case that you may not need one, and you therefore wouldn't incur the extra cost.
Yeah.
Right. Therefore, not necessarily needing the full 4,000. That's a good point. Yeah.
And I mean, I think if we set it up this way, then, because the other thing that I don't know if we'd all talked about this or thought about it, but yeah, on these extraordinary circumstances, another thing we toyed with was like, if we're going to give you money for an extraordinary circumstances, because normally it has been because of some severe structural issues, that we required a structural engineer. And so that and if we do all this up front, then, I think that'll just that'll just be how it is without us having to spell it out, right?
Mhm. Mhm. Right. So Kim, what else do we need to talk about, or does that, obviously we probably have made more work for you
No, no,
than tying it up in a nice.
that's fine. So what I'll do here quick is just, that sounds great for the HSA, and I'll just reiterate kind of what I heard, and then I think I'll have another piece to come back before you next time we meet. But so just to kind of back up, what I can do is, to Commissioner Dunlap's point, add a little bit clearer language in the information packet itself in that first kind of step that the residents might see if they're investigating this process, the HSA specifically. Certainly staff would call this out in talking to someone, but put some of that language in there about, keeping that in mind about the structural elements or HSA review, those sorts of things right away in the informational packet. I've also have the note, Chair Haley, about, just making sure in the process that we're letting them know. I believe there's a bullet point, but we can make it clear in the information packet too, that draft review is certainly going to be something that staff reviews first, and before a final can be submitted. And what we can do too is we can probably make it clear in that information packet that something that would speak to you really, we'll look for the draft to be complete in the sense that we want to see what we require in that long list of requirements. The draft should meet it, not like a draft, like kind of in the more specific sense, just a draft. We want to see it pretty laid out and ready to go. And then the third thing is the scope of work information that we've talked about. So again, not to confuse all of us, but just that there is a scope of work specifically for the HFSA, but I can put something together that essentially says for an application, a note, if you'd like to apply for an HSA funds, we'd ask for a proposal that speaks to kind of the amount and who you might need, those sorts of things. And what I'm envisioning, and it might look different as I work through it, but again, I'll bring it before you all certainly, but probably something to, Andrew, to your point of, if we have the grant money that says, hey, we're looking for these things, if you're applying for grant money, maybe we can have a box where they explain and say, this is why we know our roof might need something, or we're interested in landmarking, but we know there might be foundational things, and giving them essentially a space to talk about that as well, to give all of us a better sense of maybe where they might be looking for, if they know that the HSA is something they want. And then also, giving them an opportunity to say they just want landmarking, and at this time they're not looking for that. They don't necessarily have to provide those details because they're not going for that at this moment. So then we're not burdening them in that sense, if we're still incentivizing a different route. So if that sounds good, that's what I've sort of heard. And so it sounds like I really have one certain item to bring back before you, that kind of scope of work proposal piece. And then the other things I'll certainly add, and I can bring to review for sure as well. But if that sounds, unless I missed it, I don't want to, misconstrue what we've talked about, but that's kind of what I've heard, and that's what I have notes to do. So, okay, great. And that's wonderful. I'd skipped the part in the whole memo that's discussion direction. So that's what I was looking for. So that's perfect. And so that's all I have on this agenda item, unless of course there's anything else.
Okay. Yeah, and I think again, having all the research of how other areas are doing it, specifically SHPO, since they're really the most, I think that was really helpful. Just kind of being able to hash that out a little bit. So thanks for that.
Yeah, certainly. All right.
All right. And the next was we're looking at the coloring book. So Gary, do you want to just give some history on it before we start talking about it?
Or does Kim want to go over what she wrote first? Or?
Oh, okay. I'm sorry.
Certainly.
I'm
no.
Sorry. Yes.
No. Either way, no problem. I'll bring up the memo again, just like I did before. Okay. I'm just scrolling back down through. Not a problem. Let's go ahead.
One thing I wanted to mention about what was in the note, there were pretty close to the front. I mentioned that the artist had contacted us. That wasn't. It's not a big point, but that wasn't quite right. The artists in town, some were doing like an open studio event, and I was talking to some other artists, and this guy who did the coloring book started talking, and he had an example. So they didn't exactly approach us, but if that changes the
No, thank you. My mistake
direction
for
of it.
the error.
Well, it's maybe not a big deal, but maybe.
So for the coloring book, just as again, just tonight, just looking for some discussion direction. The main item certainly is, I know that there's Commissioner Dunlap has certainly done some legwork in the kind of in between meetings and things like that. But since I've come aboard, we've been working together a little bit. We've done some research. We have some updates for you, and then certainly we just thought this was a good opportunity to kind of get everyone together in a full meeting and be able to kind of talk about it, get some, again, discussion direction, see where we might want to go, give you some background, give you some context, see where we're at, and then go from there. So that's sort of what we're looking for tonight with this item. And so, right, so the background being the example book that we've sort of talked about before, pre-me, but I've seen it before and I've looked through it as well, would be that Color Me Boulder book. And so just as full context, the Color Me Boulder book is about 20 or so images of different buildings in the city of Boulder, and it's a coloring book of those historic structures. Some are landmarks, some not, but all historic in that sort of sense. And so the idea is that the book not only has outline drawings for someone to color in, but there's a little bit of narrative or context about each building. So, somebody could learn about different buildings throughout town in Boulder with that book. So the idea being that this would be a sort of version in Louisville and be able to do some of those things as well. And so the one note I did want to point out is that we have researched again some options to move forward, but then we will be presenting a budget amendment of $15,000 to City Council on June 15th, just to kind of have that ready to go. So it's budgeted and at our disposal for how we choose to use it. So I don't want to, I just want to be clear that it's not that, staff has already decided how we want to go. That's kind of what we want to talk about here this evening, but just that we would have the funds to kind of move forward as the commission would wish. So I just want to make sure that I'm clear on that point. And so some of the ideas, and this certainly isn't, I'm sure I'm missing some, so again, I apologize in advance for that, but some of the potential kind of options that we've talked about or that have been talked about in general so far have kind of looked like what some of the next steps that we've talked about are presented before you right here. So here's a couple listed in that 1, 2, 3 that are before you. And so kind of reading through them relatively quickly, but, so one would be one option for next forward for kind of, getting the book done and moving forward with the budgeted amount of money that we have would be just to bid the entire project out, right? And so to get quotes from artists, and then for essentially, I don't know exactly how much it would be, but for the full amount, and just say, here's the artist, we'd like you to not only do the drawings, but kind of do the book the other elements of the book, which would be getting the page together, getting it printed, getting it, published, all those sort of the whole kind of life to death on the book itself. Another option would be that number 2 you see before you. So we could set up a sort of purchasing agreement or something like that to have, the artist of the Color Me Boulder book or whomever we may choose. But, I know that we've had discussions with this particular person and have them create all the drawings, would purchase and then do the book, and then we could buy the book. It's that. So it's not that we're publishing it, right? We're getting that. We're saying you publish it for us, we'll take all of them. It's you can publish it, we'll buy a certain amount, that agreed upon an X amount. So a little similar, but a little different at the same time. You'll see the note that we haven't talked about this specifically with the Color Me Boulder artist nor anyone else. We don't know the exact numbers, but it's certainly an option we wanted to present. And then for the number 3 would be to sort of break it up into different pieces. And so this could say, putting out the call for artists, getting the drawings themselves, and then kind of moving forward on the other steps with us. So maybe we could help, write the narratives that we talked about, the histories, obviously that I'm sure the museum could help us, or we could kind of work with them to get some of that information and then do the research ourselves, whatever that might look like, write that portion, and then also work on bidding out and publishing the book ourselves. So kind of doing it ourselves, spin different chunks. Certainly we wouldn't do the drawings, but those other kind of pieces would be in-house more or less. And so that could be another option. And so those are some things to talk about. And then the other thing that I was kind of looking for direction on, or to help sort of cement, is this evening, is sort of how many would we like? So I mentioned that, for instance, the Color Me Boulder book's about 20, I think it's 21, but right around there. And do we want that many, or would we want less? Would we want to just cover certain landmarks? Would we want to do as many as possible? You know, would we want just commercial buildings or residential? You know, there's obviously a multitude of options there, but just something I wanted to get everybody's ideas and takes on, to see, you know, kind of the number and also the types and that sort of stuff. Those are the kind of two main things, right? The direction we might want to go with the project itself, and what that would look like to do it. And then starting to think about what, with the drawings we're asking for, what ones would we want, you know, what buildings would we want, and sort of how many would we want to look at. So that's the discussion direction we're looking for. Yeah, so I'll leave it there.
So those are all good options. It's good to see them all broken down like that. And I know too, Kim and I talked about even the possibility of, like, if the museum or if they would like the project, if this would be a good fundraiser, because if there was any kind of partnership, I don't know if we want to talk about that at all. And obviously Leah's here too. She might be a good, just kind of hearing this discussion that we have this possibility. But obviously the museum, especially the foundation, definitely can actually do fundraisers, and they could sell the book. So that was another just option as far as just a partnership within the city. And it is such a great idea. Like, it's such a cool concept, and I think it'd be very well received. But just trying to, I think, to like make sure that we get the most out of the project, and that it benefits the city as a whole the most. So just kind of exploring that of like, is it something that we want to be able to use to raise money for the museum, if that's even an option. So that was just something else I was going to throw in there.
And I'm going to promote Leah to panelist, just in case if she wanted to bring in. I certainly don't want to talk for them. Before I do it, thank you for bringing that up. I did forget. I did, you know, since I'm new and I'm trying to kind of meet with people, I did have a meeting with Bridget, and I talked. I mentioned, hey, you know, the commission's been talking about this book, and I mostly framed it, and you know, earnestly was just saying, have you done something like this? What did that process look like for you? And she sort of said, you know, we haven't really done one, so I can't speak too much to it. I didn't necessarily ask, you know, would you want to do a full-on partnership, or what that would look like. Certainly we would, I'm sure, you know, ask for their help with research, or, you know, having those files, but I didn't necessarily gauge, you know, what would this look like, you know, would you want to do something like that? So I don't want to speak to see if they'd be interested. Yeah. But
right, no. And it's just very beginning conversation, I think, too. Just and it might be something, I mean, it's definitely outreach for us. It's the buildings that we have landmarked, but it could be something that we fund, like could we fund to have it produced, and then, you know, could the museum use it for something that would help the museum? Like, I don't know. So all those questions are just things to ponder. So,
Well, big
Leah,
picture.
did you expect to be on?
Big picture, one of the things we do want this to do as outreach is to really explain our program, what we're offering, because it is unique. And that kind of, to me, talks against the version of somebody else producing the book in their name, and then we buy some, because we really, you know, there was a time in the early days of the preservation program where, like I mentioned earlier, there were a lot of local people who were just so excited about the little town and landmarking their homes, and it moved forward that way. And then it slowed down. Then we asked for more money and funding, from the taxpayers, and we got that. And I think we've gotten the interest of some of the wealthy realtors and developers and the like, property managers, but we haven't necessarily reached those Old Town residents that we'd really like to explain to them the program and have them come talk to us. So my thought was this book should have something probably in the beginning and probably in the end that explains our program and who to contact. If we did it in partnership with another entity in the city, the Historic Commission or the museum or the Arts Council, we could so state. But that to me would be a necessary part of whatever we produced. Anyway.
Right. That's a good point. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's just critical that however we end up doing it, that the city owns those drawings. Right? I don't know what that looks like, if the artist still does the first run from end to end for us, or I don't know. My gut is that you have to piecemeal this out. So we hire an artist, but it's clear the city owns the rights to those to that artwork, because that, I mean, I could just see people using that for a long time to come. Us in one way in a coloring book with the explanations of the program, and then I don't know, the Arts Council does something with it, 5 years from now they have something they want to do. The museum, maybe the museum just takes one sheet of paper, and when kids come in to tour the museum, they're all given one to color for 10 minutes. You know what I mean? Like that. So that's just my big thing, is that the city should own that.
Right. And that would be fall
People could
option
use it
3,
in all
looks
sorts
like,
of ways.
where we break it into pieces, and that would be option 3.
Right.
And I think I have felt like that's more feasible as far as being able to use, if we do farmers markets again, or the museum or whatever,
Right.
like just being able to use it in whatever capacity, and because it's you can print out pieces of paper easily, and use them more than just doing books. Like books are expensive. They're not always, they could be very wasteful. Like not everyone's going to use a whole coloring book, all that kind of stuff. And Leah, I saw you had your hand up. Did you have your hand up earlier?
I was just going to say that we also have Paula Elrod on the Historical Commission, who is part of the foundation as well. So you have anything that you want to take back to foundation stuff, I can talk to her too, for fundraising stuff.
Right. Okay.
And also, I'm a publisher. I don't know if you guys know that, but if you, if you, need examples of what a book would look like or something like that, I can definitely put things together.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Well, as soon as Gary mentioned the Arts Council, I was like, I wonder if there would be, and again, I don't want to take away from the artist who did the Color Me Bolder thing, but then it did make me think, we have a lot of artists in our community. Would they willing to volunteer? Like one artist does this building, and so it looks kind of in this style, and then a different artist in Boulder volunteers and does a different building, right? And they volunteer their time, so, or they volunteer their rendition of whatever building we ask them to do, and it's more of a voluntary thing. We're not asking one person to do all 20 pages or whatever, but a series of artists. I wonder if some artists would be willing to just do that.
It's a reasonable idea. I do still have the fear that we were taking away the idea that somebody generated, and
Exactly, right. So I don't, yeah.
I did some numbers from what the one artist said and what different things could cost and so I'll throw them out. They're just theoretical, but with what was mentioned, 10 drawings could cost $5,000.
Okay.
The editing of those into publishable drawings is another 1,000. Miscellaneous work like the tools to create a printable PDF at the end, maybe a couple thousand. The actual printing, I was saying if there were 300 copies, which to allow for some farmers markets, some to be given away to museum, maybe school, maybe 300 is reasonable. I don't know if you look at multiple years, but those, we had a bid that those could be printed for about $1,000. That would total about 9,000 for 300 copies, which is $30 a copy. Pretty expensive, but well in our budget. But a lot of the bigger problem we were having earlier is how to get through the city funding to maybe spend that $5,000 because of the requirement for bids and things. I mentioned earlier the possibility of using a cooperative agreement that a friend had mentioned. I know staff wasn't too excited about that idea, but looking at some of the city council's agenda recently, there were a couple of cooperative agreements, it appeared to me, with different organizations or companies to farm out the work. And that's kind of what happens is we would farm out work and then we could pay for it. But I wondered if we might be able to form a cooperative agreement with the museum or the Historic Commission or the Arts Council or somebody like that. Just a thought.
Mhm.
But then I don't know if it's not an attempt to end run the fair bidding, the fair spending of money by the city, but it does seem like we are kind of stuck at that one point, and not sure what a good answer is. Buy 5 painting or
So
5
Gary-
drawings and then 5 more. I don't know.
And Gary, with
So
the
this-
10 drawings, the 5,000, would that include us owning those images?
Yes.
5,000, would that be fine?
Yeah, we would contract for those, but then that's
We would own them.
the hurdle right there, I think. Yeah.
It should not cost that much to make it into a PDF or to print it into a book.
Yeah.
I can do that for you for nothing. I mean,
Yeah.
Yeah.
How many pages are you looking at? I can give you a rough estimate right now of what, like, just a, very simple printed 8.5 by 11 book would be.
I think that what we were looking at, it was with the 10, and this was my guess, 10 buildings with the table of contents, the front description of our program and the back, the cover, it was about 18 pages.
Yeah, okay.
The existing one was done on a special grade of paper, 100 weight or something that was suitable for watercolors as well as colored pencils and things. So might have made it a tad more expensive, but not much. The printing was actually a pretty reasonable part of it.
Okay. Yeah, because I think you could probably, let me run a number. You guys do your thing. I'm gonna.
So there's going to be a budget amendment presented to City Council for this project. And I think that was in the staff memo, right, Kim?
Yeah.
And so, and if you guys talked about this, I apologize. I may have missed it, but I wanted to make sure you understood that. So there's so we put in a $15,000 budget. One of the things was the number of images we had heard, 500 was a deal per image. So, assuming, depending on what artist we get, you know, we might want to budget a little more just to make sure we can get good images. So anyways, we put in 15,000. Of course, city council will have to approve that. It'll go along with a whole other, you know, series of budget amendments that get presented to them in June. But assuming that gets approved, then we have a $15,000 budget. And as you know, that doesn't mean we have to spend 15,000, right? So that'll be up to 15,000 to get. Yeah, and again, then it's up to you. Do you just want to buy the drawings? Do you want to actually publish the book? Do you want to pay someone? All of that. So I just want to make sure you understood that for the budget. And then I'm happy to answer any questions about any agree. You know, city council is presented with contracts, and we pay people typically to do work for the city, but they've all gone through a bid process with very few exceptions to actually hire them to do that work. So if you need any clarification on that, I'd be happy to try to answer.
How long does that process take, Rob?
It doesn't have to take very long. And again, it depends how much we spend on this project. We have this $10,000 threshold.
Okay.
I think so if we're below the $10,000, we can do basically three, you know, we could reach out to 3 different qualified individuals who do the work, and then we can hire them based on how much it's going to cost, what their qualifications are, any range of factors. But in order to make sure that we're good stewards of the money, we do have to reach out. If you go over, I think it's 10, I don't have it in front of me, but I think it's over $10,000, you have to do a more formal bid.
Yeah, okay.
Where you so it's just a little bit different, but to answer your question, I think either of those processes could take a month or 2 once we decide to do it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. And then in the less formal case, then we have a little bit more leeway. It doesn't get like, it's not a formal process where it gets, I don't know, put on a website and right. We can reach out to 3 what we deem to be qualified parties and offer it to them, and then they come back.
Yes, that's how I understand it. Yeah, and we've done that process. I've never done anything quite like a coloring book, but we've certainly hired lots of consultants. Yeah, and so I think it's generally the same thing. And I think, you know, if we come back and everybody says it's going to be somewhere between $5,000 and $10,000 to draw 10 pictures, you know, we don't have to go with the cheapest one if we have a good reason to go with a different artist.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Okay. So we're feeling like 10 is a reasonable number. Yes, first to start with anyway. Is that true? I'm just kind of circling back to Kim's questions. Like, I think how many images, I think to support our program, they all should be landmarked.
Mm-hmm.
Right. I mean, right.
Absolutely. Mm-hmm.
I'm thinking I think it's would be more interesting for a person who's actually coloring in the book to have a mix of building styles. Like, I'm thinking the grain elevator and one of the pretty houses, and you know, I don't know. I'm thinking
commercial, residential.
I think a mix would make a more interesting book. That's my opinion. What else did you have, Kim?
Or do you want to include like an agricultural drawing, perhaps, maybe even just one, like the barn near community park?
Right. Yeah.
Like the playgrounds they're at.
Right. Yeah. A mix of images.
That one's not landmark though. Otherwise, we totally would do it. I don't know if we have many architectural and agricultural.
Yeah, might not.
I don't think.
Yeah.
I mean, we don't really have agricultural downtown, so
yeah.
Right, that would be awesome if we could. Maybe in a couple months, they'll landmark.
This is a
That was
great
my-
start.
Oh.
Is there any, sorry to interrupt, but just to say, these ideas are great. And then I could put together a list and kind of, present that, and, maybe 10 that I find more probably. And then we can kind of pick that and say, yep, I like this one, or maybe this one better. I could do something to that effect as well with this guidance, and then kind of bring some more specific examples, knowing we kind of winnow it down to, X number.
Yeah.
And my preference would be we would do option 3 where we piece it out. Just to throw that out there. I think it just gives us more control, and we can just take it one step at a time and change it at any point if we want to, and we have a publisher, so I don't know. We can't probably say that actually. I don't know if we can even say as a city, like, we'll use you. I don't know if we can do that. So we can take that from the record if we need to. But
You don't have to say that. I am here though, and I will definitely, help out if you have any questions.
that's great. We're really appreciative.
Putting together the list and thinking about the list before, I also like the idea of the red barn. So, but I think we should have an emphasis on what's landmarked, but whatever are good crowd pleasers. I can
Fair enough.
see a kid wanting to color the red barn and some things like that. But
Fair enough.
yeah, maybe to look at those historic context reports we have, which include like the agriculture and that kind of history, as well as commercial and residential. Maybe that's a good source for some for 10 or more candidates.
Yep.
Yeah, especially if you do. I'm sorry, I don't know. I'm probably not supposed to really talk here. Especially if you do, something like one of our mines from the past or whatever, since it's known as a mining city, but they're not still active, but you can still look at old pictures and see what they looked like and do a, historical mining.
Great idea.
As well.
Yeah, I think this is definitely good direction.
Our
Is that
former
good for you, Kim? More work.
That's great. This is really helpful. And what I'll do is I'll probably try to bring a list, and then I'll try to keep it more than 10, but less than 25, so I don't overwhelm us. And then it gives us, if we want to do more than 10, great. If we think that there's a number that are well worthy, but then, that gives you all plenty of choice. So I'm not kind of, giving you 10 and that's the 10. I want to make sure that it's up to you all. So I'll kind of aim for around that number and then present that list, and then we can kind of see what that would look like and what we want, or if that spawns other ideas. So that's perfect. This is great.
All right. And I think that also gives us the option if we want to later add on 5 more or something, like we have our list we've kind of already agreed on. So
Yeah.
that's good. Okay.
And if I may
Anything
ask
else on the coloring book, or?
Oh, sorry. I was just going to ask a question. It might be
Oh,
exactly
go
where you're
ahead.
going. So I just want to make sure in my notes that I had it right, that it sounds like the group likes kind of option 3 as it was presented in the memo, of basically breaking it up and kind of we can do it, with the artist. And then, okay, as I'm kind of seeing the head nod. So I just want to make sure that's the way I'll go. So, okay. Excellent.
Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, thanks for being in this discussion, Leah. And nothing is set in stone, obviously. So we will be in continued conversation. And at any point, if you want to just let the commission or the foundation know what we're talking about, just for discussion. It's good.
Yeah.
It's good information.
Yeah.
For sure. Yeah. Also, another option, it sounds like you guys are talking about printing everything like in bulk or whatever. You also can do like a print on demand, and and you can adjust the page numbers as you go along with something like that, so if you and I do that kind of stuff like all the time, so I can certainly help you, walk you through that kind of thing if you need any help with that. But if you were like, oh, we want to start out with 20, but now we have 5 more ideas, whatever, you can add pages in and print them as you need them versus getting like some
Okay.
bulk and being like, oh yeah, you know, we're stuck with what we first did. You know?
Nice, good.
Sure. Okay. That's good to know too. 'Cause I feel like that is part of it is like if we have our PDF created and
Mhm.
then we're just like stuck with it, like we can't. So
No.
that's good to know.
Yeah, you can manipulate page numbers and
More
stuff like that.
flexibility.
Everything nowadays that's digital
Right. Or if we're
is
doing,
also easy.
Yeah,
yeah.
cool.
No, absolutely. Yeah, that's great. Okay. Yeah, I'm glad you were here for this. That was great.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Anything else on the coloring book before we move on?
That was a good discussion, and thanks for continuing it. And thanks again to Kim for putting together
Yeah,
the
that's awesome.
background for us.
Mhm. Yeah, it was really good.
Would we have to wait till June to start any of this? If, do we have to wait for the actual
The approved budget.
amendment in front of the city council?
You know, I think we kind of, it might be nice to wait only because then we can solidify what we'd like to, you know, what buildings we'd like to have drawn.
Yeah.
So I think in that sense, it might be nice to wait, you know, so we can all get back together, get to know what ones we'd want to put out and how many specifically, you know, that we would ask to call for artists. But I see Rob came on, so I'll
Yeah. Typically what we do if we have a contract that anticipates a budget amendment, but it hasn't been approved, is we could put that contract on the city council agenda. It can even be on consent. And then if they approve the contract, you know, they've acknowledged that they'll be approving that budget amendment. So if we get ahead of June and we're ready to go, we should just put it on a council agenda, put the contract on. If they approve the budget amendment, then we can just approve the contract without them.
Actually, June isn't that far away. I'm
I know.
still caught in the pandemic.
Yeah.
Sounds like a long time, but it's not.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
I'll say one more thing about the artwork in your coloring book is there are just programs that where you can scan in a photograph or use a digital photograph and turn it into a line drawing in seconds. You know, so if you're like, yeah, we don't want to pay an artist $500 or whatever to make a picture, you could do it yourself. You can take 10 that you like and turn them into instant coloring book, just like that. So, another option.
That's a great idea.
There's also, if you know Fiverr, do you know Fiverr.com, where you pay $5 for somebody to do something for you? Maybe not, but they have people on there who turn things and will turn your images into line drawings for $5 each. So an alternative if you don't want to do it yourself.
Yeah.
Just something else to put out there. Because a coloring book is just a line drawing, you know, so depending on how much you want how intense to be.
Right. And if it were truly a fundraiser too, like that would be much more cost effective.
Yeah.
But, yeah.
And I can do that on Photoshop like in seconds.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that's good information. Fiverr. Interesting. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah,
Right,
I can send you a link to one that I just pulled up right here. You know, even if you just want to see what I'm talking about. I don't know. Do you guys have a chat bar? You don't, do you?
No.
Okay.
We can probably look it up.
You can find it yourself. I'm sure.
So, yeah.
I took a note on that as well.
Okay.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. Yeah, for sure. All right. Yeah, so I think that's a good continuation on our coloring book. And the next was updates memo. I don't know what that means.
I just have the staff updates memo for you as well as that last item. Namely, so you can see we don't have any landmark updates or demolition subcommittee review updates. Some of you might have seen, or I think I saw a few emails, but I wanted to make sure that I updated everyone on 1131 Jefferson. So that is a landmark property, and I was contacted, I believe it was last week or the week prior. I'm mixing up weeks, but that they had started some work on the steps, and we had not received the permit. So we did put a stop work order and then put it through the subcommittee review process. And so the subcommittee ultimately did release the permit to replace the porch. And so since some of you might have seen it or driven by it, I wanted to make sure I addressed it this evening. So the picture you see is from the state's, inventory form. So I believe the photo is probably from around 2013, since that's when the form itself was from, even though it's black and white. It just was scanned in. So that's kind of what the steps look like before. The proposal for the alteration certificate, or the permit here in this case, was to take them down, but also to put them back up in essentially the same footprint. So they curved out the same and took the same amount of rise and run, and looked the same. So the planters are what you see in the kind of brick sides, or that are flanking the steps themselves. And so the proposal would be to put those up very similar. They wouldn't be brick the same way, and the way that they would be structurally put together would help the water run a little bit more efficiently, so it wasn't running into the brick, which was what apparently was one of the problems here. So a couple things again. The proposal would be to put the stairs back the way they were, in terms of footprint, kind of the style. The stairs themselves are going to be made of concrete as they were before. And the other reason that sort of the rationale you see listed there is we do believe at some point that the stairs were probably altered. It's a likelihood that historically the concrete itself, the steps itself, were probably there from either the beginning, or at least some, historic, well over 50 years for the bungalow. But it's likely that in terms of just style and craftsman style and period, architectural, proclivities, the bricks were probably added later. And we do have a 1948 assessor's photo, but it's a little blurry, so it was hard to exactly see the bricks themselves. But just stylistically speaking and historically speaking, they were probably altered at some point. So for those two reasons, the rationale was to release the permit. So I know that was kind of in-depth review, but I just wanted to give everyone, since it's a landmark structure and we probably drove by it, I just wanted to give everyone, make sure full transparency, and that we did see it and we did review it. So I wanted to add that as well. And then the only other item I have would be regarding the upcoming schedule. So you can see our next meeting would be May 17th. And I did just want to bring up that we have, I believe it's every 2 years, we have just basically like an open government training. And so this is the year that it's come up. And so typically, from my understanding, that happens before the meeting, so we can kind of still hold the meeting as normal. And so that would mean starting about an hour earlier. And so I just wanted to make sure I address that, see if that's good for everyone. We do have them lined up, but that if this is, a particularly bad evening, we can always push it back to a different date. But as of right now, we'd be looking at starting then an hour earlier, May 17th. And I just want to see how that sounded for everyone. So we wouldn't need to do this training. It's just, if this isn't quite enough time to get schedules, we can certainly change it.
I'm
That's
good.
fine.
Okay, excellent. And I'll certainly send out, information and updates. So I'm sure I'll need a reminder to make sure, and we all will. So I'll make sure I send that along too. So excellent. And then I have one more item. I do apologize, but this is regarding the museum. This would be for, I'm going to share my screen one more time. This would be for an event that they're holding called Lenses on Louisville. You might have heard it. I think there was an email blast about it, but they're holding it May 8th and May 22nd. And so it's 2 different Saturdays where they're inviting people to come along and, photograph artistic elements of downtown, as well as some other residential structures. And Bridget had asked if we wanted to have a table, and I said yes, I'd be happy to be there both days. But I wanted to put it out to the group to see if anybody would want to sit there with me. So it'd be, you could see starting the orientation starts at 10, so we wouldn't necessarily have to be there at that time, but I probably would be. I don't want to make anyone commit this evening. I'll send an email out just reminding and seeing if anyone has some time on those either Saturday. I wouldn't necessarily need everyone, and we'd have to, make sure we don't have too many people for kind of sunshine laws. But if anyone would just want to sit there with me for even a little bit of time, one of the days, really just promoting the historic preservation, landmarking, that sort of stuff, just the program in general. Just so we're there and we have a presence, and it was really nice of the museum to kind of extend. So I'm certainly, if it's just me that's there, I don't mind at all. I just think it might be fun if you guys wanted to share your stories and that sort of stuff too. So again, no commitments this evening. I'll send a note out about that too, but I wanted to make sure I announced it in front of everyone. And sorry, Leah, I think I cut you off.
No, I just said I'll be there too.
Yeah.
Already, so.
So great. Awesome. So that's just the last thing. Like I said, I'll follow up, but just to put that in, like, the kind of tickler there to think about it. So that's all I have. And thank you.
Can I add one thing? So on a related note, I did go to the Historical Museum Commission meeting last month in March. My bad, I probably should have asked to be put on the agenda for tonight. So if you'd like, I can go over what was covered in that meeting, some museum updates and things like that. Leah's here as well. But it's been a long meeting. We can maybe do that next meeting. I know Keith is due to go to May's meeting. So it's kind of up to you what you want to do. I think the biggest, lots of good stuff happening at the museum, as always. Kind of the biggest thing probably is next month the museum is looking to reopen in May for limited hours. But they'll post a sign on the door when they're open and how many people are allowed inside. They're talking about extending hours coming up sometime soon into one evening. So next month is Preservation Month, so that's exciting. But that's probably the most update for now. So if you'd like, we can talk about this next meeting and combine it with Keith's, or I'm happy to go over it now.
Yeah. Does anyone have any time restraints, or do you want to wait until next meeting?
I would prefer next meeting.
Okay.
Sure.
Yeah. So the biggest things were that they're opening more hours in general, and then Preservation Month next month.
Yes, Preservation Month, we're reopening next month. And Leah, correct me if I'm wrong, but there's a discussion of when to extend hours. So I think the commission, museum commission, will be talking about what evening to do that, what the hours are, because there's staffing concerns with museum staff, obviously. So those hours aren't starting in May, most likely, but the museum itself is in May, which is exciting.
Okay. Nice. That's exciting. That's really good. All right.
At the risk of making us last a little longer, I had a question that maybe has a quick answer. I think that project that's going on at Main and South Street, with the front, I think it came before us as some kind of review, PUD, or maybe like the one we saw today, but I couldn't find it on our agendas. But I was pretty sure that the building that was toward the back of that property was an existing building with round steps, like the one we just looked at, and it was to be retained. And there's some indication that that was demolished and rebuilt. Do we know anything about that? No.
I don't know about the stairs, but yes, it was, there were structural issues with it. And so I think it did get approved for it got demoed pretty much down to the foundation and rebuilt in the same, it has to be rebuilt to the same form. So that did happen. I think as far as the review goes, that probably took place in 2014 or 2013 when it came to PUD review. And then typically the demolition review gets rolled into that if there's any demolition, and then all these years passed and they ended up getting they ended up demoing the house. And in retrospect, it probably should have gone at least through subcommittee review, if not additional review, before they did that demo.
Okay, yeah. Well, it happened, I guess, but it probably shouldn't have been quite that
Probably
sequence.
shouldn't have happened without HPC review.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
Oh.
All right, no more questions. I would move that we adjourn.
You're taking my job.
Oh.
I'll agree with that one, Gary.
I'm just teasing. I'm getting my agenda so I can make sure, because that was the updates from commissioners, so we're right on track. So yeah, if we have a motion to adjourn, do we have a second?
I'll second.
All right, all those in favor?
Aye.
Sure.
Thank
All
you.
right, good night. Thank you guys.
Aye.
Good night, guys.
Thank you.